Section 1 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sonia. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 5. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 1. Mirabel the Beauty by Jonas P. Phillips, Esquire. Happy childhood! When memory carries us back to thy joyous days, and the countless dear associations therewith connected, the cares, sorrows, and disappointments of maturer life are all forgotten, and we live over again the pleasant moments of our young existence. What fair visions are conjured up in the recollection of bygone years! The scenes of our youth are again before us, the village schoolhouse, the old playground, our young companions, all are seen in that magic mirror which restores the past in all its pristine bloom and loveliness. Even the merry shouts and the blithe songs that were so familiar to us again come to our ears, and the laughter of one more gladsome than the rest, and the bird-like melody of whose voice has lingered upon mine ears through all the changes and vicissitudes of existence. Mirabel Lester! Alas, that a life which dawned so joyously should close in sorrow and desolation. I left the pleasant little village of Mantua when the heroine of my story was 10 years of age, and a more lovely, sylph-like creature never flitted in the dream of a poet's fancy. Her complexion was a clear red and white, and a profusion of golden ringlets waved over a neck and shoulders the very models of symmetrical perfection. Mirabel Lester was indeed a little beauty. The only child of wealthy and adoring parents, every whim of childhood was indulged. Yet petted and caressed as she was one of the most amiable little creatures in existence, and dotingly fond of her little orphan cousin, Ida Coddington, whose parents were both dead, and who had been consigned to the guardianship of Mirabel's father. Ida was nearly of the same age with Mirabel, and although exceedingly beautiful, her beauty was of a totally different character from that of her fair young cousin. Mirabel, we have said, was fair and golden-haired. Ida was a little brunette, and her hair was as black as the plumage of the raven, and her countenance had ever a pensive cast, while that of Mirabel was always bright with the smiles of a joyous spirit, and she often endeavoured to create the same joyousness in her young companion. The rich ornaments which Mirabel, before the glass in her mother's boudoir, would clasp around her throat, had no brilliancy in the eyes of the little Ida, and when her gay cousin clasped the dazzling necklace around the throat of the little orphan, which strangely contrasted with her mourning habiliments, Ida was restless until she relieved herself from the ornament, which had no charms in her eye, nor seemed to her half so valuable as the simple braid fastened with a golden locket containing the hair of her deceased parents. Pass we over the childhood of the cousins, and sketch rapidly the stories of their lives from the period when they were introduced into society. Mr. Lester had taken up his residence in Philadelphia. His mansion was one of the most splendid in the West End of the city, and was constantly visited by the wealthy and most fashionable. Mirabel was the admired of all beholders. The beauty of childhood had ripened and perfected. Accomplished, gay, and fascinating, she was everywhere surrounded by a crowd of admirers, while Ida, who still retained the pensiveness we have noticed, was comparatively the object of little admiration. Mirabel had received many offers, but as yet her heart had never yielded to the influence of that passion which was to seal her destiny for weal or woe. One evening the cousins were invited to attend an assembly at the mansion of the wealthy Mr. Islington, the acknowledged leader of the ton. All the world was to be there, and among them the Count de Susanne, a young French nobleman, but recently arrived, and whose commanding figure and splendid moustache had already bewildered the brains of more than one half of the gay young ladies in the quiet city of Penn. Mirabel was attired for the evening, and as she surveyed herself in the mirror, her smiles proved that her toilette had been completed to her entire satisfaction. "Not ready yet, Ida?" said the beauty to her cousin, who entered the room as she took from the stand a splendid bouquet, which had been sent to her from some unknown admirer. "Quite ready, Mirabel," replied Ida. "How queen-like and beautiful you are looking this evening." "Thanks for the compliment, ma chère. and you are looking as pensive and pretty as ever, but attired altogether with too much simplicity for an assemblage like that we shall meet at Mrs. Islington's. Let me fix this ornament among your dark ringlets, Ida," said the belle, at the same time taking from her jewel case a glittering tiara of diamonds. "No, dear Mirabel, remember, I am no heiress, and the simplicity with which I am attired is better suited to my state and inclination." "You were ever self-willed in this particular, Ida. After all, I do not think such beauty as yours requires the adventitious aid of ornament. I should be a fright without it. Besides, I have dressed to-night for conquest. For know, my pretty coz, I am determined to be the Countess of Soissons, or remain plain Mirabel Lester for the rest of my life." "Then you are determined to fall in love with this lion, Mirabel?" "I have already fallen in love." "Nay, cousin," interrupted Ida, "I thought you had never met the Count." "Nor have I, sweet simplicity," rejoined Mirabel. "I have fallen in love, nevertheless, not with the man, but his title. There is something in being a countess, notwithstanding your republican taste covets not such distinctions." The carriage was announced, and the conversation being thus interrupted, the young ladies wrapped their mantillas around them, and in a short time were among the brilliant crowd assembled at Mrs. Islington's. Here, as at all other parties of the season, Mirabel Lester was the belle of the room. Even the entrance of the Countess Soissons scarcely diverted the attention of the young gentlemen from the fair object of their admiration. "Ah, here is the lion of the evening, Miss Lester," said one of Mirabel's most ardent admirers. "Now may we despair of winning your attention even for a moment? After all, there is nothing very distingué in his appearance." "I cannot agree with you," replied Mirabel. "I never have seen a man of more graceful bearing." The Count was now introduced to our heroine, who soon engrossed his attention, and during the remainder of the evening he scarcely left her side. But Ida, was she not noticed? Was the orphan cousin of the rich belle totally neglected on that occasion? Not so. There was one present who admired her unpretending beauty and appreciated the graces of her intellect. Ida was beloved by a young gentleman who, like herself, was left an orphan at an early age, and while the foreign count was enchanting the ear of Mirabel with glowing accounts of Parisian life, Gansevoort Mordaunt was engaged in conversation with Ida, far more interesting to both. "Joy, dearest Ida," said Mirabel to her cousin one morning, some weeks after this memorable evening. "Joy is always welcome," replied Ida, blushing and half suspecting the cause of congratulation. "What so delights you, dear Mirabel?" "The prospect of your happiness. Gansevoort Mordaunt has asked a solemn question, and papa, having consented, gave me permission to tell you to fix as early a day as possible for the consummation of poor Mordaunt's wishes." "I wish I knew the day then that the Countess Soissons intends leading you to the altar, dear Mirabel. I should so like to date my happiness from the day which also sees you a bride." Mirabel turned pale as marble. The quick eye of Ida perceiving the sudden change, she started from her seat, exclaiming, "Heavens, Mirabel, you are ill! Let me call for assistance." "Not for your life, Ida. I shall be better presently. Sit down. I have something of importance to confide to you." "It must be important, Mirabel, for never did I see you looking so pallid and serious. What is the matter?" "Ida, you must promise to keep my secret. At all events, until after I am gone." "Gone? Where? What mystery is this? I promise anything, everything you can ask, dear Mirabel, for I am sure this secret involves your happiness. Speak." "I am the wife of the Countess Soissons." "Mirabel!" almost shrieked Ida. "Do not condemn me, Ida, even by a thought. Doubtless you think I have acted rashly, foolishly. So the cold world may think. I have deceived my parents. In that I feel and confess myself most culpable." "Why did you deceive them, dearest Mirabel? The promotion of your happiness was the chief aim and object of their existence. Had the Count solicited your hand with your approval, my life upon it, my kind uncle would have consented." "So did I tell the Count, Ida, but there were weighty reasons. which he urged with an eloquence so irresistible, for a private marriage, that my objections were overruled. The spell of the enchanter was upon me. I consented, and a fortnight since we were secretly married. A fortnight hence I shall be with him on our voyage to France. But before I go I must see you married to Gansevoort Mordaunt. Oh, do not look so reproachfully at me, dear Ida. Remember we have grown together, and in all our happy intercourse never, never has there been a cold look or an angry word between us. And never shall there be, dear Mirabel, whatever may be the consequence of this hasty marriage. But surely you, that is, the Count, means to reveal it to your father. You will not quit your home until you leave it his acknowledged wife. Time will show, was the evasive answer. You know my secret. I was unhappy until I had the Sauzanne's permission to confide it to you, my only friend. And now, dear Ida, fix an early day for your marriage. Say this day week. Be it so, dear Mirabel, but you were to be my bridesmaid. What will the world say if you attend not in that capacity? You, my constant companion, my near relation. And may I not so attend, Ida? And you a wife? Oh no, dear Mirabel, it would be practising a deceit at the altar of our Creator. We must contrive some excuse. Oh, Mirabel, God grant that you may be happy. Amen. I shall be happy. The Count loves me. My parents will forgive me. And the world, Mirabel? The world! What care I for the world, if I have my husband's love, my parents' forgiveness, and your unaltered affection? I shall heed not the world. Besides, Ida, though they may blame Mirabel Lester, they will not dare to censure the Countess de Sauzanne. And now I will leave you, for I know Gansevoort will soon be here to learn your decision. This is the gravest interview we have ever had. Let us both seem very gay and very happy when we meet at dinner. 1 week after the foregoing disclosure, Gansevoort Mordaunt led Ida Coddington to the altar. The marriage ceremony was performed at Christ Church, and at Ida's request but few were present on the occasion. Mr. Lester and his wife attended, of course, but Mirabel was absent. She was really unwell and anxious, and Ida easily obtained from her confiding and indulgent parents their permission that she should remain at home. The bridal party returned to the residence of Mr. Lester, but Mirabel was not there to greet them. The servant informed her parents that Miss Mirabel had left in the carriage with the foreign gentleman, and handed a letter to Mr. Lester, and he trembled as he broke the seal of the envelope. That letter apprised him of the secret marriage of his daughter to the titled foreigner, and also informed them of her embarkation that very day for France, with her husband. Her duplicity was acknowledged and forgiveness invoked, and while the grief-stricken parents lamented the error of their child, their hearts granted the pardon she solicited. A gloomy wedding day was Ida Coddington's. 2 years had passed since the marriage of the orphan niece of Mr. Lester to young Mordaunt. Fortune had smiled upon her, and her domestic life was one of cloudless felicity. She was the happy mother of a daughter to whom she had given the name of Mirabel. But where was she, after whom the little innocent had been so named? In the long interval referred to, not a line had been received from the Count or his wife. The letters of Mirabel's unhappy and anxious parents were all unanswered, and at last they resolved upon a voyage to France, in order to ascertain, if possible, the fate of their child. But Mirabel returned to them ere the preparations for their voyage were completed. It was a dreary night in December. The family was seated around the hearth, for Ida, even since her marriage, had continued to reside with her uncle. A carriage stopped at the door, and shortly afterward a female entered the apartment, an infant in her arms. Her abrupt entrance astonished all, and as she threw herself at the feet of Mr. Lester, and upraised her pale and anguish-stricken face, the father recognized his child, and he exclaimed, "Gracious heaven! Can this be Mirabel?" "Yes, yes. Father, forgive me, spurn me not, for the sake of this helpless little one." She was already forgiven, but sadly had poor Mirabel been betrayed. He in whom she had trusted, whose gay exterior and title were his only passport to good society in America, was an impostor. His title had been assumed. He was a needy adventurer, a gambler, and, as poor Mirabel too soon discovered, the husband of another. He was dragged from her side to a prison, upon the complaint of the wife he had abandoned, and to the galleys, while poor Mirabel, with the innocent offspring of her unhappy union, was left desolate and unprotected. At length she determined to make an effort to return home. In looking among the papers of her betrayer, she found the intercepted letters of her parents, containing renewed expressions of affection and forgiveness, which gave her new life and courage. Collecting the little treasures she had left, she converted them into money and left Paris. Arrived at Havre, she obtained a passage on board of a vessel about sailing for Philadelphia, and arrived there, as we have already seen, ere the preparations of her parents to proceed to France in quest of her were completed. She was once more completely happy. She was forgiven by her parents and surrounded by those she loved. Yet was she sadly changed. All joyousness had fled from her. Her eyes had lost their brilliancy, and her cheeks their bloom, and none who knew her in her days of happiness would recognize in her emaciated form, her hollow cheeks and dim and sunken eyes, the poor remains of Mirabel the Beauty. End of section 1.
Section 2 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tasha Mapes. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 5, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 2, Transplanted Flowers. Ye living gems of cold and fragrant fire, die ye forever when ye die, ye flowers? Take ye when in your beauty you expire, an everlasting farewell of your bowers. Have I not seen thee, wild rose, in my dreams, like a pure spirit, beauteous as the skies? When the deep blue is brightest and the streams dance down the hills, reflecting the rich dyes of morning clouds and cistus woodbine twined. Didst thou not wake me from a dream of death? Yea, and thy voice was sweeter than the wind, when it inhales the lovesick violet's breath, bending it down with kisses where the bee hums over golden gorse and sunny broom. Soul of the rose, what saidst thou then to me? We meet, thou saidst, though severed by the tomb. Lo, brother, this is heaven, and thus the just shall bloom. End of section 2.
Section 3 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 5, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 3. The Curate-Confessor of Viroflay, a real ghost story by Colley, Grattan. Viroflay is a pretty little village, a couple of miles from Versailles, on the Paris side, within view from the main road, and snugly screened from the east winds by the noble wood of Sartory. It forms one of the succession of pleasant objects between the capital and the truly regal creation of Louis XIV. It has become the fashion to say, and for aught I know to think, that this monarch did nothing for France, but with Versailles and its environs before my eyes, I dissent flatly from the assertion. I hold that magnificence in a king, like charity in a private person, covers a multitude of sins. Reflecting on the evils which this despot entailed on his country, I see that they brought their remedies with them, and marking the living traces of his pride, I feel that they have stamped on the national mind the impress of the splendor which characterized his own. There are several methods of going from Paris to Versailles. Men who are the least enslaved by prejudice, indolence, or the gout, take their sticks and walk. Others ride. The spoiled children of fortune drive in their own carriages. Those less lucky, who like regularity and kill time by a stopwatch, go in gondolas. I, who hate to clip his wings or pull him by the forelock, and who give him ample leisure to whet his scythe and ogle his victims through the empty end of his glass, prefer the gondolets. It may be well to mention that gondolet, as here used, does not mean a water-going vehicle, but is adopted as the diminutive of gondole, the appellation of those long-bodied, lubberly conveyances dragged so apparently against their will by 4 horses, and I choose the epithet as more delicate and dignified than any of the villainous cognomina applied to the humble family of 2-wheeled carriages which I so punctually patronize. This degraded and ill-treated tribe of vehicles was once a flourishing and consequential body corporate. Patient suffering was not then its badge, nor obloquy its only notice. I do not know how it was, but I used to fancy that the raw-boned horses, for they were always of the same breed, held up their blind and crazy heads, stiffened their skeleton necks, and pawed forth their bowed and tottering forelegs with somewhat of an aristocratical and feudal air. The drivers, too, in those beaux jours, cracked their whips with a more independent twist, and pried not as they are now wont into every house along the road, nor hallooed forth Paris, Paris, Versailles to every foot passenger with their present cringing tone. I look on these poor drivers as I regard a Negro, a gypsy, a Jew, clothesman, or any other unfortunate being under the ban of proscription. I therefore always give them a helping hand along their comfortless career, and feel much more at my ease when looking up at the ponderous gondole as its flashy yellow panels flaunt past us on the road. But these gondolets, so much the butt of contempt, have nevertheless many advantages over their gaudy competitors. In the summer season they are much cooler, and at all times, to a man of lively fancy, much easier. You have not much rumbling of wheels, and no rattling of windows, no suffocation from bad smells, for the air, like my advice, perhaps comes in at one ear and goes out at the other. You run no risk of an unpleasant countenance before you, nor of receiving a whiff of garlic into yours, for every one sits front foremost, in contrast to the corps of Irish yeomanry, whose captain on a retreat always ordered it to advance backwards. So if your front-rank neighbours fall asleep and tumble forward, you are not the pillow they recline on. You halt when you like to stretch your legs. You are not hurried at starting or stopping, and when you arrive, after all, and within an hour more or less of the unwieldy monsters, I'm writing, since I cannot run them down. Then, let me ask, does it go for nothing to have the facetiae of the driver cheering your way? Is it naught to have the brave and intelligent soldiers of the guard flowing over with thrilling anecdotes of flood and field, who go out to spend their Sundays at Versailles? Is it nothing to have the neat, chattering washerwomen, or perhaps the washerwomen's pretty daughters, coming with their linen to Paris on the Monday morning? Nothing to hear all these, and others of their class, reading you lessons of courtesy and gallantry at every step, to hear of sensibilité, and sentiment, and morale, and physique, and amitié, and amour, and 100 other delicate distinctions from the mouths of artisans and operatives, who in England breathe nothing but gin and tobacco. Have I never gone in a gondolet, I never should have gained all the good things to be picked up in such a way of travelling, never should have learned the adventures of the Amazon of Cartier Saint Louis, who has 17 wounds on her corpus, and enjoys the pension of a sous-officier, and never should have heard of the ghost story of le bon Curé de Viroflay, nor seen his cross of the Legion of Honour, which he won as a soldier and wears as a priest. But before I repeat that story, and while he may be supposed reciting it to me as we jogged along in our gondolet, let me, gentle reader, give a hint or two for the passenger who goes thus from Paris to Versailles. Let him then, above all things, remember not to forget to give a sou at starting to the infirm, enfeebled wretch, male, female, or epicene, who places a stool for his foot as he steps into the gondolet. Let him laugh heartily, and be pleased at, and give a sou to those antic, soot-covered, one-coloured harlequins, who tumble and caper at the sight of the carriage, and pipe their monotonous, cuckoo-noted salutation, and tell you grinningly, Je vous aimerai bien. These little barefooted, despised and dirty Savoyards, who come down, poor things, in droves from their mountains to sweep chimneys and clean shoes, and for whose misfortune there is lack of soot and mud in the summer season. Let him give a suit to the fine bald-pated octogenary at Sèvres, whose head was 2 or 3 times anticipated by Rembrandt's imaginings, who tells you of his age, his poverty, his deux bras cassés, and his inability to earn his pauvre pain. Let him give 5 sous over and above his bargain to the poor driver. Let him, but I need not go on with those appeals to the charities of men. There are objects enough on the road to give the hint more forcibly than I can. I must, however, caution the traveller to read by all means the parallel lessons each side of him on his journey, to moralize just on quitting the Place Louis XV on the bathing boys swimming down the river to the left, opposed to the full-grown children floating on the tide of fashion in the Champs-Élysées to the right. Then there is the golden dome of the Invalides, directly fronting the Pont Graffeur, glory on the one hand and smoke on the other. Passing on, there is the new bridge of Saint-Cloud, as useful and unpicturesque as art could make it, and the mouldering remains of the old one at Sèvres, as romantic and rotting as any natural beauty. The palace of the king rises royally above the woods to the north, and on the south is the cottage hiding itself in verdure, where lived one of our best poets, and after him an unworthy aspirant for the mantle which, luckily for the world, he has not yet cast away, the very resting place where genius would love to nestle. And now arrived at Viroflay. Now for the story of its worthy curate. Yes, my good sir, continued the curé, the previous part of our conversation having led to, but not bearing directly on my present subject. Yes, the man who goes through life in the mere routine of its pleasures, or even its crimes, knows little of the true nature of pleasure, or the real effect of crime. It is he who cuts short his dissipation and full career, and retires from the world with all the capability of enjoyment that sees in the mellow light of reflection the true nature of what he has enjoyed. I have done that, and am now, at 50, after 10 years of seclusion, happy in the memory of delights that will never fade. The darker portion of my problem must be proved, thank heaven, from other experience than mine, but no one, I firmly believe, can know the terrible consequences of guilt but he who seeks refuge from remorse in solitude. Common contrition or punishment even fails to let him into the depths of suffering he has provoked. If a good man who has enjoyed life would wish to enjoy it still, or a bad one would repent his wicked ways, it is there they must retire to learn enjoyment and do penance. That is to say, replied I, that their imagination has ample play, and brings back all the scenes of life with tenfold exaggeration. You must have known its power fully, my good father, from the extremes through which you appear to have passed. Known the power of imagination, rejoined the curé with a peculiar emphasis, a look as if his mind wandered to other worlds, and a gesture of nervous agitation. Of imagination? And pray, sir, what is that? Will you be good enough to define for me the direct line between fact and fancy? Reverend sir, said I, somewhat astonished and piqued at his half-serious, half-ironical tone, whoever has learned the first principles of drawing knows that the most difficult of all things is to trace a straight line. True, sir, true. Excuse my petulance. You touched inadvertently a tender chord. I did not calculate how far back or how deep my idle observations would have thrown my thoughts. Be satisfied, however, that I have felt the full force of solitude in reference to guilt as well as folly. The latter as respects your own early life, the former as relates to whom? Asked I, with a rather unjustifiable keenness of inquiry. But there was something in the curé's manner and look that spurred my curiosity beyond the bounds of that arrogant servility which is commonly called good breeding. Sir, said he, in an impressive and somewhat severe tone, you may be aware that my duty often leads me into scenes where every human passion is laid bare to me, but at the same time the sufferer, the sinner, let me say, is covered with a sacred veil. Neither the name of the penitent nor the nature of the crime may be breathed from the confessor's lips. This rebuke silenced me, but I was by no means sulky, and some little attentions to the good curé, as we jogged along, brought him to his former sociable tone, and led to a renewal of our chat. But that epithet is really too familiar and trifling to express the nature of our conversation, which insensibly caught a most serious tinge, and became deeper and deeper at almost every phrase. I thought there was something on the curé's mind connected with recollections that my former random observations had aroused. I made no attempt to check the troubled current of his thoughts. There is a sacredness in the anxiety of a good man which no wise one dares to disturb. and those who best know the wisdom of playing the fool on fit occasions, the practical paraphrase of the dulce est decipi, have the readiest tact at seeing when the cap should be doffed and the bells silent. For my part, I should in the present case have assumed a gravity, even if I felt it not, but I was thoroughly and deeply impressed with it as the good curé discoursed. I scarcely remember by what subtle link our talk was led to supernatural subjects. My old remark about the force of imagination was certainly at the end of the chain along which our ideas ran with electrical speed. We were soon, however, deep in the topic which possesses of all others the profoundest interest for the enthusiast as a point of his creed, for the sceptic as a mark of scorn. But believer and infidel alike feel a shudder as they pass through a graveyard at night, and whose are the nerves that do not thrill at the solemn narration of a ghost story? "You are going on to Versailles?" asked the curé, with a determined tone of interrogation, as the gondolier suddenly stopped at a narrow road leading from the main chaussee to the left, and almost covered with the graceful branches of acacias and lime trees which perfumed the air all around us. "Yes, are not you?" rejoined I, much disappointed at this apparent reproach of a separation from my companion. "No," said he, "this way lies my path," and it was then only I discovered that I had been journeying and talking with le bon curé de Viroflay, of whom I had heard so often and so favourably. A few words of invitation to walk with him to his village hard by, and thence through the wood of Sartory to Versailles, were answered by my springing out of the gondola, and in a minute more we were en route together under the perfumed canopy that hung across the byway already mentioned. "You see that roofless skeleton of a cottage yonder on the skirts of the wood," said the curé, pointing to the object he described. "Well, that wretched hovel once formed for me, and not long since, a place of illustration to much of what we have been talking about. It was for some years the refuge of terrible guilt, and the scene of more terrible expiation, ay, and of more than our conversation has embraced. The wretched criminal who lived and died there was one of those men whom the furnace heat of our revolution reddened into fiends, whose blood turned to flame, and who sought to cool their burning hands by plunging them into streams of gore. He was steeped in cruelty and crime, but of all his deeds one of still deeper horror than the rest preyed on and haunted him with fearful force. By day or night, sleeping or waking, he had no respite from the memory of this act. Would I could say repentance was joined with remorse, but he repented not. A morbid sense of sin, a frightful state of present suffering, and a fierce dread of future punishment were the sum of his feelings. He shunned mankind. His whole intercourse with the world was limited to the sustenance of life. He employed a poor beggar woman to seek his scanty food, but he would not, or could not perhaps, bear to see another human face. Neither had he cat or dog, or any domestic animal, to solace him with a look of dependent sympathy. He lived in the wood, flying even at the sight of the foresters, and the sudden sound of the axe as it struck against a falling tree has been often followed by a shriek of despair from the poor sinner that made the rough woodman shudder. Yet no one then knew the secret of his emotion or the cause of his misanthropy. They were never known to but one, and that one is myself. But at the time I speak of, he used to shun me with peculiar care. Twice or thrice has he started from the wood into the path along which I was walking, and at sight of my priest's dress, with a look, a shudder, and a shriek of mixed horror and hatred, he would spring into the covert and fly. As I heard him rushing through the branches of the underwood, I used to cross myself and send a blessing after him, and offer up a prayer which I hope found its way to heaven. At length came an end to this awful tragedy of life. One night, about a year ago, a deep, solemn summer's night, moonless and starless, oppressive and thick, I was lying in bed in my own cottage in the village there, unable to sleep from heat, reading by the light of my lamp, and inhaling the perfume of the roses that hung clustering round my open window, when I heard suddenly, close by the casement, that well-known shriek which no voice but his could utter. I sprang from my bed, hurried on my clothes, and went out into the garden. An irresistible influence seemed forcing me along. I caught the sound once more, distant and fainter, and in the direction of the hovel. I followed it instinctively, and as I came close to the dreary abode, I was shocked by the report of a pistol from within. My blood curdled. I was sure the frantic wretch had destroyed himself. I was right. I entered the open door, and found him lying on the earthen floor, bathed in his own blood. The old woman was stooping over him, striving to staunch the wound with her rags. The courageous and clear-sighted humanity of her sex told her to do so. A man would have ran for assistance, and left the sufferer to bleed to death, but all the aid of art could not have saved the miserable suicide. The wound was mortal. We placed him on his pallet. He listened to my voice. He heard my words, the first sounds of consolation that had broken on him for years. I had touched his heart, and I saw tears gush from his eyes, the first he had ever shed. I sat by his side alone, for I dispatched the old woman for the village surgeon, and the sinner had time and strength to mutter his full confession. He died of exhaustion, for the stream of life would not yield to my efforts to stanch it. When the woman and the doctor arrived, they found me beside the ghastly corpse. I performed my last duties and left the hovel. Never had I suffered so much. Death and blood had long been familiar to me. Deathbed confessions were of almost daily occurrence, but I had never before seen a self-murderer die, never had heard such a tale of horror as that. I reached my cottage and found the door open as I had left it. I entered. The lamp was still burning by my bedside. I flung myself down, and reciting some passages of my breviary, I strove to compose myself to sleep, but I was long in a fever of agitation. At times I fancied I heard the shriek, and I sprang up in the bed. Again I thought I heard a rustling in the rose trees, and could almost believe I distinguished the sounds of feet flying, as did those of the suicide when he was driven frantic from the cottage window on discovering me reposing so calmly on my bed. For he had come with the intention of seeking me, and pouring his secret into my bosom, but despair seized on him at sight of my tranquil confidence, and his next impulse was to place the fatal pistol to his breast. By degrees I grew drowsy. The book dropped from my hand. The lamp was dying beside me. A lurid glare was around. My eyes, which had been half closed, opened suddenly wide. I gazed at the foot of the bed, and there I saw the ghastly and bloody figure of the suicide, kneeling with uplifted hands and glazed eyes fixed upon me, and I could not move a limb. I would have shut out the fearful object, but my lids refused to close. I felt the eyeballs starting from their sockets. I strove to cover my head with the bedclothes, but the spectre, leaning against them, held them fast. At length a shower of perspiration, cold and clammy, burst from all my pores. I was relieved, though exhausted, and already my eyes became familiarized to the horrid object. I rose up in the bed and stepped upon the floor. I made the sign of the cross, but the spectre did not disappear. I repeated more than one prayer, but still it knelt, following me with its leaden gaze. I confess that in my terror the memory of some old superstition, profane, if not blasphemous, crossed my mind, and I muttered in fear and trembling some absurd incantations that I learned in boyhood for exorcising spirits. The spectre stirred not, but a loathsome grin spread across the livid and blood-stained face. At this sight I raised my hands above my head, and I felt the hair stand up on end against my palms. My knees tottered, and my teeth chattered. The spectre seemed to chuckle inwardly, for it shook and grinned, but no sound escaped it. "Good God!" cried I am beset by a fiend. The evil one has thrown himself before me. I am caught in the snare." The spectre nodded its hideous head, as if in confirmation of my fears. I strove to scream, not exactly for help, for I felt myself hopeless, but in the despairing notion that I might scare away the ghost. My throat was parched, the voice was choked in its attempt at utterance. The spectre never turned its eyes from me, nor relaxed its grin. Can I ever forget that basilisk glance? After standing thus for some minutes, all the energy of my despair was aroused, and I prepared to rush through the doorway, which was close at the foot of my bed. But the spectre knelt directly across, and whole mountains of adamant had not formed a more impassable barrier than did that horrid shade. I stood again transfixed. Again I prayed, and still the spectre mocked me. It seemed fixed to the place forever. I heard the village clock strike the hour. It was 2. I strove to turn my head toward the window, hoping to see the dawn. I could not move it. The frightful attraction before me kept it firm fixed. The quarter struck. I thought an age had elapsed since the tolling of the hour. Another quarter, another. Oh, that eternity of horror! The clock struck 3. Long, solemn peals that roused the country for leagues, but the spectre stirred not yet. I saw the dawn. The sunbeams that entered behind me at the window stole gradually along the wall at either side, and at length the yellow light fell full upon the spectre, and gilded its odious aspect with a tinge of horrible splendor. The sunbeams shot through it, proving it to be a phantom, yet it maintained all the dreadful reality of matter. Every nerve and fibre of the fleshless form was displayed to me. It was already a half-formed skeleton. I sickened with disgust, and flung myself back upon a chair close to the window. The morning air breathed on me, and I recovered. I heard the cock crow. My heart throbbed with rapture at this summons. I looked to observe the spectre vanish, but it only grinned again, and mocked me with horrid grimaces. I thought of escaping by the window, but as I attempted to rise, I felt as though held down by an immovable weight of lead. My breast heaved and panted, and I felt suffocating. Holy Mary, thought I, can this indeed be real? Surely I sleep. This phantom is only of my brain. At this moment I heard someone in the garden. I made an effort in desperate delight to turn my eyes. I did so and saw the old gardener hobbling across the walk. I was resolved to speak if possible. Another forcible attempt at utterance succeeded. I bade old Simeon good morrow. Good morrow, Reverend Father, said the pious old man. Your reverence is up betimes. It must have been a dream, said I, and turned my eyes boldly in the direction of my bed. God, how I thrilled with agony at seeing the spectre, unmoved from its position, unchanged in attitude and look. Reason and fear, that so often o'ermasters reason, combined to endow me with almost more than mortal energy. I will not believe this, cried I aloud. I dare not support it. I am going mad. Heaven save and protect me, and give me grace under this terrible affliction. Or do I indeed sleep, in spite of all this evidence of waking sensation? Can I indeed sleep? With a wild throb of ecstasy at the revived hope that I slept, I seized in a paroxysm of agitation the water jug that stood on my table. This will awake me, if indeed I sleep, exclaimed I, and I flung the whole contents in my face. A convulsive and half-suffocating sensation in my throat, and a fierce start from the chair in which I sat, were the instant consequences. At the same moment a bunt of feeble laughter from a well-known voice burst upon my ear. I looked forward with all my eyes. The spectre had vanished, and I saw in its stead the figure of my old female attendant standing before me, but in a moment her laugh was followed by a cry of terror. I looked into the glass beside me, and saw with horror almost equal to hers that I was covered with blood. In an instant I understood the whole appalling pageant. I had indeed been in that state of animated stupor, that doubtful double existence between reality and imagination, when the mind and body are half insensible and half alive. Such was the state of my feelings, at once excited and exhausted, and oh, that such may never be the lot of any human being. A night like that is an eternity of misery, a purgatory upon earth, a living hell. But I must not dwell on the subject. Its recurrence is horrible. I must let the memory of that dreadful scene moulder away from my brain, as the remnant of that wretched hovel is crumbling in the winds. Such was, in substance and nearly word for word, the curate's recital. I confess it made me thrill in the spoken detail. How it may tell on paper I cannot venture to surmise, but my readers, let them think of it as they may, must not cavil at its title, nor accuse it of promising more than I meant to perform, for while I knew I was about to tell a real ghost story, I never intended to say it was the story of a real ghost. End of section 3.
Section 4 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Manolakes. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 5, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 4. The Wine Cellar. Stephen Curlew was a thrifty goldsmith in the reign of the second Charles. His shop was a mine of metal. He worked for the court, although, we fear, his name is not to be found in any record in the State Paper Office. Stephen was a bachelor, and, what is strange, he never complained of his loneliness. His chased ewers, his embossed goblets, his golden bars were to him wife and children. Midas was his only kinsman. He would creep among his treasures like an old gray rat, and rub his hands and smile as if communing with the wealth about him. He had so long hugged gold to his heart that it beat for nothing else. Stephen was a practical philosopher, for he would meekly take the order, nay, consult the caprice, of the veriest popinjay with the humility of a pauper, when at a word he might have outblazoned lords and earls. If this be not real philosophy, thought Stephen, as he walked slipshod at the heels of his customers, what is? Stephen was a man of temperance. He was content to see venison carved on his hunting cups. He cared not to have it in his larder. His eyes would melt at clustering grapes chased on banquet goblets, but no drop of the living juice passed the goldsmith's lips. Stephen only gave audience to Bacchus when introduced by Plutus. Such was the frugality of Stephen in his 65th year, and then, or his name had not been eternalized in this our page, temptation fell upon him. It was 8 o'clock on a raw spring evening, and Stephen sat alone in his back room. There was no more fire upon the hearth than might have lain in a tinderbox, but Stephen held his parchment hands above it and would not be cold. A small silver lamp, with a short wick, for the keen observation of Stephen had taught him the scientific truth that the less the wick, the less the expenditure of oil, glowed, a yellow speck in the darkness. On the table lay a book, a treatise on precious stones, and on Stephen's knee, Hermes the True Philosopher. Stephen was startled from a waking dream by a loud and hasty knocking at the door. Mike, the boy, was out, but it could not be he. Stephen took up the lamp and was creeping to the door when his eye caught the silver, and he again placed it upon the table and felt his way through the shop. Unbolting the 5 bolts of the door, but keeping fast the chain, Stephen demanded, "Who is there?" "I bear a commission from Sir William Brouncker, and I'm in haste." "Stay you a minute, but a minute," and Stephen hurried back for the lamp, then hastily returned, opened the door, and the visitor passed the threshold. "'Tis not Charles," cried Stephen, alarmed at his mistake, for he believed he had heard the voice of Sir William's man. "No matter for that, Stephen. You work for men, and not for Christian names. Come, I have a job for you," said the visitor with the easy, assured air of a gallant, lounged into the back parlor, followed by the tremulous Stephen. "Sir William," began the goldsmith. "He bade me use his name. The work I'd have you do is for myself. Fear not, here's money in advance." And the stranger plucked from his pocket a purse, which, in its ample length, lay like a bloated snake upon the table. Stephen smiled and said, "Your business, sir?" "See here," and the stranger moved the lamp immediately between them, when for the first time Stephen clearly saw the countenance of his customer. His face was red as brick, and his eyes looked deep as the sea, and glowed with good humor. His mouth was large and frank, and his voice came as from the well of truth. His hair fell in curls behind his ears, and his mustache, black as coal, made a perfect crescent on his lip, the points upward. Other men may be merely good fellows. The stranger seemed the best. "See here," he repeated, and produced a drawing on a small piece of paper. "Can you cut me this in a seal ring?" And Stephen put on his spectacles. "The subject is Bacchus squeezing grape juice into the cup of death," said the stranger. "An odd conceit," cried the goldsmith. "We all have our whims, or woe to the cellars," said the customer. "Well, can it be done?" "Surely, sir, surely. On what shall it be cut?" "An emerald, nothing less. It is the drinker's stone. In a week, Master Curlew?" "This day week, sir, if I live in health." The day came. Stephen was a tradesman of his word, and the stranger sat in the back parlor, looking curiously into the ring. "Per Bacco! Rarely done. Why, Master Curlew, thou hast caught the very chops of glorious Liber, his swimming eyes and blessed mouth. Ha, ha! Thou hast put thy heart into the work, Master Curlew, and how cunningly hast thou all but hid the dart of death behind the thyrsus of the god. How his life-giving hand clutches the pulpy cluster, and with what a gush comes down the purple rain, plashing into rubies the cup of Mars." "It was my wish to satisfy, most noble sir," said Stephen meekly, somewhat confounded by the loud praises of the speaker. "May you never be choked with a grapestone, Master Curlew, for this goodly work. Ha!" and the speaker looked archly at the withered goldsmith. "It hath cost thee many a headache ere thou could do this." "If I may say it, I have labored hard at the craft, have been a thrifty, sober man," said Stephen. "Sober? Ha, ha!" shouted the speaker, and his face glowed redder, and his eyes melted. "Sober? Why, thou wast begot in a wine cask, and suckled by a bottle, or thou hadst never done this. By the thigh of Jupiter, he who touched this, and the stranger held up the ring to his eye and laughed again, he who touched this hath never known water. Tut, man, were I to pink thee with a sword, thou'dst bleed wine. Aye, cried Stephen, I bleed, and he glanced fearfully towards the door, and then at the stranger, who continued to look at the ring. The skin of the sorriest goat shall sometimes hold the choicest liquor, said the stranger, looking into the dry face of the goldsmith. Come, confess, art thou not a sly roisterer? Or art thou a hermit over thy drops, and dost count flasks alone? Aye, aye, well, to thy cellar, man, and yes, thine arms are long enough. Bring up 10 bottles of thy choicest Malaga. Aye, my cellar? Malaga? Stammered Stephen. Surely thou hast a cellar. And the stranger put his hat upon the table with the air of a man set in for a carouse. For 40 years, but it hath never known wine, cried the goldsmith. I have never known wine. The stranger said nothing, but turning full upon Stephen, and placing his hands upon his knees, he blew out his flushing cheeks like a bagpipe, and sat with his eyes blazing upon the heretic. No, never, gasped Stephen, terrified, for a sense of his wickedness began to possess him. And dost thou repent? Asked the stranger, with a touch of mercy toward the sinner. Aye, humph, I'm a poor man, cried Curlew. Yes, though I'm a goldsmith and seem rich, I'm poor, poor. Well, 'tis lucky I come provided. And the stranger placed upon the table a couple of flasks. Whether he took them from under his cloak, or evoked them through the floor, Stephen knew not. But he stared at them as they stood rebukingly upon his table, as if they had been 2 sheeted ghosts. Come, glasses, cried the giver of the wine. Glasses? Echoed Stephen. In my house? Right, glasses. No, cups. Let them be gold ones. And the bacchanal, for it was plain he was such, waved his arm with an authority which Stephen attempted not to dispute, but rose, and hobbled into the shop, and returned with 2 cups, just as the first cork was drawn. Come, there's sunlight in that, eh? Cried the stranger as he poured the wine into the vessels. So, thou hast never drunk wine? Well, here's to the baptism of thy heart. And the stranger emptied the cup, and his lips smacked like a whip. And Stephen Curlew tasted the wine, and looked around, below, above, and the oaken wainscot did not split in twain, nor did the floor yawn, nor the ceiling gape. Stephen tasted a second time. Thrice did he drink, and he licked his mouth as a cat licks the cream from her whiskers, and putting his left hand upon his stomach, softly sighed. Ha ha! Another cup? I know thou wilt. And Stephen took another, and the 2 flasks were in brief time emptied. They were, however, speedily followed by 2 more, placed by the stranger on the table, Stephen opening his eyes and mouth at their mysterious appearance. The contents of these were duly swallowed, and lo, another 2 stood before the goldsmith, or, as he then thought, 4. There never was such a Bacchus, cried Stephen's customer, eyeing the ring. Why, a man may see his stomach fairly heave, and his cheek ripen with wine. Yet, till this night, thou hadst never tasted the juice? What could have taught thee to carve the gods so capitally? Instinct, instinct, called out the goldsmith, his lips turned to clay by too much wine. And yet, I care not so much for... How old art thou, Stephen? 65, and Stephen hiccuped. I care not so much for thy death, Stephen. Instinct should have made thee a better hand at death. 'Tis a good death, cried the goldsmith, with unusual boldness. A most sweet death. 'Tis too broad. The skeleton of an alderman with the flesh dried upon him. He hath not the true desolation, the ghastly nothingness of the big bugbear. No matter, I'm content. But this I'll say, though thou hast shown thyself a professor at Bacchus, thou art yet but a poor prentice at death. Stephen Curlew answered not with words, but he snored very audibly. How long he slept he could not well discover, but when he awoke, he found himself alone. No, not alone. There stood upon the table an unopened flask of wine. In a moment the mystery broke upon him, and he sprung to his feet with a shriek, and rushed into the shop. No, he had not been drugged by thieves. All was as it should be. The stranger, like an honest and courteous man, had taken but his own, and without disturbing the sleeper, had quitted the house. And Stephen Curlew, the wine glowing in his heart, yea, down to his very nails, stood and smiled at the unopened flask before him. Stephen continued to eye the flask, and though its donor had shared with him he knew not how many bottles, Stephen was resolved that not one drop of the luscious juice before him should wet an alien throat. But how? Where to secure it? For in the new passion which seized upon the goldsmith, the one flask seemed to him more precious than the costly treasure in his shop, a thing to be guarded with more scrupulous affection, more jealous love. In what nook of his house to hide the glorious wealth? What corner where it might escape the profane glances and itching fingers of his workmen? The thought fell in a golden flash upon him. The cellar! Aye, the cellar! Who of his household ever thought of approaching the cellar? Stephen seized the flask and lamp and paused. The cellar had no lock. No matter, he had a bag of 3-inch nails and a stout hammer. The next morning, neighbors met at the closed door and windows of the goldsmith, and knocked and shouted and knocked. They were, however, reduced to a crowbar, and at length burst into the house. Every place was searched, but there was nowhere visible old Stephen Curlew. Days passed on, and strange stories filled the ears of men. One neighbor vowed that he had had a dream or a vision, he knew not which, wherein he saw the goldsmith whirled down the Strand in a chariot drawn by a lion and a tiger, and driven by a half-naked young man wearing a panther skin, and on his head vine leaves and ivy. An old woman swore that she had seen Stephen carried away by a dozen devils, very much in liquor, with red faces and goat legs. However, in less than a month, the goldsmith's nephew, a scrivener's clerk, took possession of Curlew's wealth, and became a new-made butterfly with golden wings. As for Stephen, after various speculations, it was concluded, to the satisfaction of all parties, that he must have been carried away by Satan himself, and the nephew cared not to combat popular opinions. But such, in truth, was not the end of the goldsmith. Hear it. Stephen, possessed by the thoughts of the cellar, with the one flask, a lamp, nails, and hammer, proceeded to the sacred crypt. He arrived in the vault, and having kissed the flask, reverently put it down, and straightway addressed himself to the work. Closing the door, he drove the first nail, the second, third, and borrowing new strength from the greatness of his purpose, he struck each nail upon the head with such force and precision of a cyclops, burying it deep in the oak. With this new-found might, he drove 11 nails. The 12th was between his thumb and finger when, looking round, oh, sad mischance, awful error, he had driven the nails from the wrong side. In a word, and we tremble while we write it, he had nailed himself in. There he stood, and there stood the flask. He gasped with horror, his foot stumbled, struck the lamp, it fell over, and the light went out. Shall we write further on the agony of Stephen Curlew? Shall we describe how he clawed and struck at the door, now in the hope to wrench a nail, and now to alarm the breathing men above? No, we will not dwell upon the horror. It is enough that the fate of the goldsmith was dimly shadowed forth in the following paragraph. Some laborers digging a foundation near, no, we will not name the place, for the family of the Curlews is not yet extinct, and there may be descendants in the neighborhood, near blank, found a skeleton. A hammer was beside it, with several long nails. A small wine flask was also found near the remains, which it is considered could not have been in the vault in which they were discovered less than 1 century and 3/4. O ye heads of families, and O ye thrifty, middle-aged bachelors, boarding with families or growing mouldy by yourselves, never, while ye live, forget the terrible end of Stephen Curlew. And O ye heads of families, and O ye aforesaid bachelors, albeit ye have only one bottle left, never, never nail up the wine cellar. End of section 4.
Section 5 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 5, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 5. The Indian Wife. Tamaroo was the daughter of a powerful chieftain of the Sioux Indians, and she was the only being ever known to turn the relentless old man from a savage purpose. Something of this influence was owing to her infantile beauty, but more to the gentleness of which that beauty was the emblem. Here was a species of loveliness rare among Indian girls. Her figure had the flexile grace so appropriate to protected and dependent women in refined countries. Her ripe, pouting lip and dimpled cheek bore the pleading air of a grieved childhood, and her dark eye had such an habitual expression of timidity and fear that the young Sioux called her the startled fawn. I know not whether her father's broad lands or her own appealing beauty was the most powerful cause of her admiration, but certain it is, Tamaroo was the unrivalled belle of the Sioux. She was a creature all formed for love. Her downcast eye, her trembling lip, and her quiet, submissive motion all spoke its language, yet various young chieftains had in vain sought her affections, and when her father urged her to strengthen his power by an alliance, she answered him only by her tears. This state of things continued until 1765, when a company of French traders came to reside there for the sake of deriving profit from the fur trade. Among them was Florimond de Rance, a young indolent Adonis whom pure ennui had led from Quebec to the Falls of St. Anthony. His fair, round face and studied foppery of dress might have done little toward gaining the heart of the gentle Sioux, but there was a deference and courtesy in his manner which the Indians never pay woman, and Tamaroo's deep sensibilities were touched by it. A more careful arrangement of her rude dress, and anxiety to speak his language fluently, and a close observance of his European customs soon betrayed the subtle power which was fast making her its slave. The ready vanity of the Frenchman quickly perceived it. At first he encouraged it with that sort of undefined pleasure which man always feels in awakening strong affection in the hearts of even the most insignificant. Then the idea that though an Indian she was a princess, and that her father's extensive lands on the Missouri were daily becoming of more consequence to his ambitious nation, led him to think of marriage with her as a desirable object. His eyes and his manner had said this long before the old chief began to suspect it, and he allowed the wily Frenchman to twine himself almost as closely around his heart as he had around the more yielding soul of his darling child. Though exceedingly indolent by nature, Florimond de Rance had acquired skill in many graceful arts which excited the wonder of the savages. He fenced well enough to foil the most expert antagonist, and in hunting his rifle was sure to carry death to the game. These accomplishments and the facility with which his pliant nation conformed to the usages of every country made him a universal favorite, and at his request he was formally adopted as one of the tribe. But, conscious as he was of his power, it was long before he dared to ask for the daughter of the haughty chief. When he did make the daring proposition, it was received with a still and terrible wrath, that might well fright him from his purpose. Rage showed itself only in the swelling veins and clenched hand of the old chief. With the boasted coldness and self-possession of an Indian, he answered, "There are Sioux girls enough for the poor pale faces that come among us. A king's daughter weds the son of a king. Eagles must sleep in an eagle's nest." In vain Tamaroo knelt and supplicated. In vain she promised Florimond de Rance would adopt all his enmities and all his friendships, that in hunting and in war he would be an invaluable treasure. The chief remained inexorable. Then Tamaroo no longer joined in the dance, and the old man noticed that her rich voice was silent when he passed her wigwam. The light of her beauty began to fade, and the bright vermilion current which mantled under her brown cheek became sluggish and pale. The languid glance she cast on the morning sun and the bright earth entered into her father's soul. He could not see his beautiful child thus gradually wasting away. He had long averted his eyes whenever he saw Florimond de Rance, but one day when he crossed his hunting path he laid his hand on his shoulder and pointed to Tamaroo's dwelling. Not a word was spoken. The proud old man and the blooming lover entered it together. Tamaroo was seated in the darkest corner of the wigwam, her head leaning on her hand, her basket work tangled beside her, and a bunch of flowers the village maidens had brought her scattered and withering at her feet. The chief looked at her with a vehement expression of love, which none but stern countenances can wear. "Tamaroo," he said in a subdued tone, "go to the wigwam of the stranger, that your father may again see you love, to look on the rising sun and the opening flowers." There was mingled joy and modesty in the upward glance of the startled fawn of the Sioux, and when Florimond de Rance saw the light of her mild eye, suddenly and timidly veiled by its deeply fringed lid, he knew that he had lost none of his power. The marriage song was soon heard in the royal wigwam, and the young adventurer became the son of a king. Months and years passed on, and found Tamaroo the same devoted, submissive being. Her husband no longer treated her with the uniform gallantry of a lover. He was not often harsh, but he adopted something of the coldness and indifference of the nation he had joined. Tamaroo sometimes wept in secret, but so much of fear had lately mingled with her love that she carefully concealed her grief from him who had occasioned it. When she watched his countenance with that pleading, innocent look which had always characterized her beauty, she sometimes would obtain a glance such as he had given her in her former days, and then her heart would leap like a frolicsome lamb, and she would live cheerfully on the remembrance of that smile through many wearisome days of silence and neglect. Never was woman, in her heart-breaking devotedness, satisfied with such slight testimonials of love as was this gentle Sioux girl. If Florimond chose to fish, she would herself ply the oar, rather than he should suffer fatigue, and the gaudy canoe her father had given her might often be seen gliding down the stream, while Tamaroo dipped her oar in unison with her soft rich voice, and the indolent Frenchman lay sunk in luxurious repose. She had learned his religion, but for herself she never prayed. The cross he had given her was always raised in supplication for him, and if he but looked unkindly on her, she kissed it, and invoked its aid in agony of soul. She fancied the sound of his native land might be dear to him, and she studied his language with a patience and perseverance to which the savage has seldom been known to submit. She tried to imitate the dresses she had heard him describe, and if he looked with a pleased eye on any ornament she wore, it was always reserved to welcome his return. Yet for all this lavishness of love, she asked but kind approving looks which cost the giver nothing. Alas, for the perverseness of man in scorning the affection he ceases to doubt. The little pittance of love for which poor Tamaroo's heart yearned so much was seldom given. Her soul was a perpetual prey to anxiety and excitement, and the quiet certainty of domestic bliss was never her allotted portion. There were, however, two beings on whom she could pour forth her whole flood of tenderness without reproof or disappointment. She had given birth to a son and daughter of uncommon promise. Victoire, the eldest, had her father's beauty, save in the melting dark eye, with its plaintive expression and the modest drooping of its silken lash. Her cheeks had just enough of the Indian hue to give them a warm, rich colouring, and such was her early maturity that at 13 years of age her tall figure combined the graceful elasticity of youth with the majesty of womanhood. She had sprung up at her father's feet with the sudden luxuriance of a tropical flower, and her matured loveliness aroused all the dormant tenderness and energy within him. It was with mournful interest he saw her leaping along the chase with her mother's bounding sylph-like joy, and he would sigh deeply when he observed her oar rapidly cutting the waters of the Missouri, while her boat flew over the surface of the river like a wild bird in sport, and the gay young creature would wind among the eddies or dart forward with her hair streaming on the wind and her lips parted with eagerness. Tamaroo did not understand the nature of his emotions. She thought in the simplicity of her heart that silence and sadness were the natural expressions of a white man's love. But when he turned his restless gaze from his daughter to her, she met an expression which troubled her. Indifference had changed into contempt, and woman's soul, whether in the drawing-room or in the wilderness, is painfully alive to the sting of scorn. Sometimes her placid nature was disturbed by a strange jealousy of her own child. I love Victoire only because she is the daughter of Florimond, thought she, and why, oh why does he not love me for being the mother of Victoire? It was too evident that Durance wished his daughter to be estranged from her mother and her mother's people. With all members of the tribe out of his own family, he sternly forbade her having any intercourse, and even there he kept her constantly employed in taking dancing lessons from himself, and obtaining various branches of learning from an old Catholic priest, whom he had solicited to reside with him for that purpose. But this kind of life was irksome to the Indian girl, and she was perpetually escaping the vigilance of her father to try her arrow in the woods, or guide her pretty canoe over the waters. Durance had long thought it impossible to gratify his ambitious views for his daughter without removing her from the attractions of her savage home, and every day's experience convinced him more and more of the truth of this conclusion. To favour this project, he assumed an affectionate manner toward his wife, for he well knew that one look or word of kindness would at any time win back all her love. When the deep sensibilities of her warm heart were roused, he would ask for leave to sell her lands, and she, in her prodigality of tenderness, would have given him anything, even her own life, for such smiles as he then bestowed. The old chief was dead, and there was no one to check the unfeeling rapacity of the Frenchman. Tract after tract of Tamaroo's valuable land was sold, and the money remitted to Quebec, where he intended to convey his children on pretence of a visit, but in reality with the firm intent of never again beholding his deserted wife. A company of Canadian traders chanced to visit the Falls of St. Anthony just at this juncture, and Florimond Durance took the opportunity to apprise Tamaroo of his intention to educate Victoire. She entreated with all the earnestness of a mother's eloquence, but she pled in vain. Victoire and her father joined the company of traders on their return to Canada. Tamaroo knelt and fervently besought that she might accompany them. She would stay out of sight, she said. They should not be ashamed of her among the great white folks of the East, and if she could but live where she could see them every day, she should die happier. Ashamed of you, and you the daughter of a Sioux king? Exclaimed Victoire proudly, and with a natural impulse of tenderness she fell on her mother's neck and wept. Victoire, 'tis time to depart, said her father sternly. The sobbing girl tried to release herself, but she could not. Tamaroo embraced her with the energy of despair, for after all doubts and jealousies, Victoire was the darling child of her bosom, She was so much the image of Florimond when he first said he loved her. "Woman, let her go!" exclaimed Arance, exasperated by the length of the parting scene. Tamaroo raised her eyes anxiously to his face, and she saw that his arm was raised to strike her. "I am a poor daughter of the Sioux. Oh, why did you marry me?" she exclaimed in a tone of passionate grief. "For your father's land," said the Frenchman coldly. This was the drop too much. Poor Tamaroo, with a piercing shriek, fell to the earth and hid her face in the grass. She knew not how long she remained there. Her highly wrought feelings had brought on a dizziness of the brain, and she was conscious only of a sensation of sickness, accompanied by the sound of receding voices. When she recovered, she found herself alone with Louis, her little boy, then about 6 years old. The child had wandered there after the traders had departed, and having in vain tried to waken his mother, he laid himself down by her side and slept on his bow and arrows. From that hour Tamaroo was changed. Her quiet, submissive air gave place to a stern and lofty manner, and she, who had always been so gentle, became as bitter and implacable as the most bloodthirsty of her tribe. In little Louis all the strong feelings of her soul were centred, but even her affection for him was characterized by a strange, unwonted fierceness. Her only care seemed to be to make him like his grandfather, and to instill a deadly hatred of white men. The boy learned his lessons well. He was the veriest little savage that ever let fly an arrow. To his mother alone he yielded anything like submission, and the Sioux were proud to hail the haughty child as their future chieftain. Such was the aspect of things on the shores of the Missouri when Florimond de Rance came among them after an absence of 3 years. He was induced to make this visit, partly from a lingering curiosity to see his boy, and partly from the hope of obtaining more land from the yielding Tamaroo. He affected much contrition for his past conduct, and promised to return with Victoire before the year expired. Tamaroo met him with the most chilling indifference, and listened to him with a vacant look, as if she heard him not. It was only when he spoke of her boy that he could arouse her from this apparent lethargy. On this subject she was all suspicion. She had a sort of undefined dread that he too would be carried away from her, and she watched over him like a she-wolf when her young is in danger. Her fears were not unfounded, for de Rance did intend by demonstrations of kindness and glowing descriptions of Quebec to kindle in the mind of his son a desire to accompany him. Tamaroo thought the hatred of white men, which she had so carefully instilled, would prove a sufficient shield, but many weeks had not elapsed before she saw that Louis was fast yielding himself up to the fascinating power which had entrammelled her own youthful spirit. With this discovery came horrible thoughts of vengeance, and more than once she had nearly nerved her soul to murder the father of her son. But she could not. Something in his features still reminded her of the devoted young Frenchman who had carried her quiver through the woods and kissed the moccasin he had stooped to lace, and she could not kill him. The last cutting blow was soon given to the heart of the Indian wife. Young Louis, full of boyish curiosity, expressed a wish to go with his father, though he at the same time promised a speedy return. He always had been a stubborn boy, and she felt now as if her worn-out spirit would vainly contend against his wilfulness. With that sort of resigned stupor which often indicates approaching insanity, she yielded to his request, exacting, however, a promise that he would sail a few miles down the Mississippi with her the day before his departure. The day arrived. Tamaroo decked herself in the garments and jewels she had worn on the day of her marriage, and selected the gaudiest wampum belts for Louis. "Why do you put these on?" said the boy. "Because Tamaroo will no more see her son in the land of the Sioux," said she mournfully, "and when her father meets her in the spirit land, he will know the beads he gave her." She took the wondering boy by the hand and led him to the waterside. There lay the canoe her father had given her when she left him for the wigwam of the stranger. It was faded and bruised now, and so were all her hopes. She looked back on the hut where she had spent her brief term of wedded happiness, and its peacefulness seemed a mockery of her misery. And was she, the lone, the wretched, the desperate, and deserted one, was she the startled fawn of the Sioux, for whom contending chiefs had asked in vain. The remembrance of all her love and all her wrongs came up before her memory, and death seemed more pleasant to her than the gay dance she had once loved so well. But then her eye rested on her boy, and, O God, with what an agony of love! It was the last vehement struggle of a soul, all formed for tenderness. "We will go to the spirit land together," she exclaimed. "He cannot come there to rob me." She took Louis in her arms as if he had been a feather, and springing into the boat, she guided it toward the falls of St. Anthony. "Mother, mother, the canoe is going over the rapids," screamed the frightened child. "My father stands on the waves and beckons," she said. The boy looked on the horribly fixed expression of her face and shrieked aloud for help. The boat went over the cataract. End of section 5. Section 6 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 5, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 6, A Tale of Venice, by C. Farlane. The sun was sinking behind the dark blue hills of Friuli, and lengthening the shadows of Venice across the rippling waves of the Adriatic, when two senators who were taking their evening promenade on one of the murazzi, or outer terraces, which the industry of man had gained and secured from a formidable element, perceived a trim galley on the purple line of the horizon pressing forward toward the city. "That should be a vessel of the state," said one of the signors. "From whence may she be?" "Why, not from Constantinople," replied his companion. "It is time that some of that conquering expedition should be returned to the Winged Lion. Saint Mark grant that it proves as you say, but she keeps a gallant course, and will soon be here to speak for herself." The two senators, who, though both advanced in years, still glowed with that patriotic spirit which was destined to raise the low-sunk islets of Venice to such unprecedented glory, leaned against a parapet wall that ran along the edge of the Murazzo, fixing their earnest gaze upon the vessel which, rapidly advancing, grew in magnitude to their eyes at every minute. She had been labouring on with all her long oars, but now the sun had set and an evening breeze, a vento di terra, from the lofty mountains of Dalmatia roughened the gulf. The sails, already set, were properly bent to catch the favouring wind, and another sail was hoisted, until the hulk seemed to bear the proportion to them that the body of the sea-fowl does to its widely spreading and pure white wings. Nor could the flight of the gull or the albatross be well more rapid or direct than the sailing of the Venetian galley. She rushed like a thing of life over the darkening waves, and presently the white foam was seen curling, and the phosphoric light flashing before her impetuous bow. As she neared, the last gleams of day showed the proud banner of the Republic floating on her lofty stern. "My Tebaldo, my son, my only one," fell a victim to the liquid and unextinguishable fire of the Greeks at the first siege of their heretical capital. But there are other fathers than me in Venice, and mothers who love their offspring, and wives who adore their husbands, and of a certainty for some of these there is great joy. The galley is the Corriere of the great Dandolo, the swiftest vessel of our fleets, and she comes, the harbinger of happiness to thousands. The rest will not be far behind. The senator who pronounced these words began in a subdued and melancholy tone, but his voice strengthened and his eye flashed as he continued, losing in the bliss of others and in the contemplation of the glory of his country, the sense of his private and irremediable misfortune. Viva San Marco, viva la Santa Chiesa, and the Republic of Venice, that has but the keys of St. Peter within the boasted gates of Constantinople, exclaimed the other senator. Viva San Marco and the Republic, rejoined the childless man. Their aged voices had scarcely ceased to vibrate when a loud, continuous shout, a shout of transporting joy and triumph, rose from the deck and the rigging of the galley, and made itself heard despite of distance and the lash and roar of the waves that broke in foam at the feet of the two senators. The next instant that soul-stirring exclamation was answered by another shout, but absolutely smothered, while it lasted, the sounds of wind and wave, and turning round, the senators saw, on the edges of other terraces and on the scattered islets that afforded the best points of observations, the mass of the population of Venice gazing, like themselves, on the returning galley. In an instant, numerous barks were seen to glide from the canale, and dancing in fantastic groups over the heaving sea, to pull with strenuous oars toward the ship, the patriotism or the more private affections of many, not brooking the delay of a few minutes, which would see her at anchor within Venice. As she came, with the breeze that still freshened singing through her shrouds, a simultaneous display of countless blue lights was launched from her deck high into the heavens, where the crescent moon, with a single star at her side, seemed to smile at these testimonials of joy, and to welcome the wanderers back again. The mimics of heaven's thunders, the pealing cannons, were not yet known, but the roar of voices that again rose from the Marazzi and the ship in the boats midway between them might almost equal the rimbombo of artillery, than which it was infinitely more replete with meaning, for the united voices of thousands distinctly syllabled the patriotic cry, which was still Viva San Marco e la Città di Venezia. There was silence for a while. The galley, now surrounded by the barks from the shore, glided round one of the islets which had intercepted the prospect, and presently the crew saw all the low houses of the town, with the clear domestic lights shining from their lattices, full before them. The transport that then bounded in the hearts of the wanderers, the shout that then rose from the galley deck, must have been intense. For what can consecrate the joys of home, like one glad glance from ocean's troubled foam? The two senators quitted the parapet and repaired with hasty steps to the galley quay, where they found many of their order, with most of the leading citizens already assembled, and anxiously awaiting to speak with the gallant commander of the Corriere. Soon the welcome vessel stood with her prow a few spans' length from the shore, and anon with rapid manoeuvres she swung round, and lay with her broadside against the edge of the quay. Another shout and cry of triumph, and the captain leaped on shore, and bowed before the senators and citizens of Venice. "Thou art welcome, Sanuti," said the foremost of the company. "Thou art welcome as the confirmer of good tidings, but doubly welcome as a hero who has honoured his Venetian blood by his deeds before the walls of Constantinople." The captain bowed more lowly than before. "The Scampa Via of Zani has then brought in safety our lord the Doge's despatches to the Senate of Venice?" inquired he modestly. "It has even done so much," replied the senator, "and we have long since learned that the winged lion is flying for the second time over the walls of the capital of the East." "And long may it there fly," cried Sanuti, "and may the sons of Venice plant the lion, the standard of San Marco and the Republic, over many a conquest as fair as this." The assembled multitude echoed the words of the captain, and the air was rent by shouts of Pianta Leone, the popular war cry, which was indeed destined to be heard on many a foreign shore. But Sanuti, resumed the senator, who had already spoken, what of the fleet? A portion certainly should be at Venice ere this, were it but to lay the trophies in the temple of our saint, under whom our arms have so prospered. I left the fleet to-day at noon. They had gained the height of Cape Torella, and only let this fair breeze blow till midnight, and we shall see them at the rising of tomorrow's sun. This news spread with the swiftness of lightning through the multitude, and thence through the whole city, and the childless senator had predicted aright when he said that for some there would be great joy in Venice on this night. There was indeed too much joy, and alas, in many instances too much assured sorrow or harrowing apprehension to permit sleep. The affectionate wife, with tears in her eyes, kissed the little slumberer in his cradle, or assured the half-forgetful prattler on her knee that tomorrow he should see his father. Or with provident care she turned over the humble treasures of her coffers to select fitting raiment for her long-absent spouse, or with diligent hands she prepared the restoring condiments, so welcome after the privations of a tedious sea voyage, or she sought the draughts for the wine-cup which maketh glad the heart of man. The fond mother, whose son had gone to the east, with the red cross on his breast, rested not on her pillow, but gazing on the flickering lamp, asked 1,000 times, "Oh, will the light of tomorrow's sun show me my boy in his strength and in his beauty, or assure me that the light of life has for ever quitted his eyes?" The betrothed maiden, or she who had cherished a fond passion, paced her chamber floor with hurried steps, or gazing out of her chamber on the sea waves, sighed to the strong winds that agitated them, as love did her young bosom. And will he come with the morrow? And will he love me as when he went? That short summer night seemed of interminable length at Venice, but the morrow came at last, and in the grey horizon, at the very point where the Corriere had first appeared on the preceding evening, a broad white sail was seen. A sail, and another rose to the eye from that sober but brightening line, until the whole fleet was in view, and advanced, the orb of day rising in their rear, like a vast flock of wild swans, glancing their long white necks and buoyant white wings in the golden beams of morning. In the city the matin summons to prayers sounded cheerfully on the ear, and in each Christian temple a song of thanksgiving succeeded the words of supplication. Our story is laid in very remote times, but it was not until their religious duties were performed that the people of Venice began their preparations for the triumphal reception of their home-wending heroes, or hastened to meet the object of their hearts' warm affections. But when in their weakness and insufficiency they had paid their due to heaven, they entered on the business of life with zeal, and the city was agitated from one end to the other. Carpenters and other artisans were employed in laying stages for the warriors to tread upon in their descent from the victorious galleys, or in erecting platforms whence the Venetian fair might wave their kerchiefs to the brave, or galleries whence the musicians might hail the return of those who had prevailed in the good fight, with the Lion and St. Mark for their aid. Women and children ran to gather the scanty supply of verdure and of flowers that the sea-girt city afforded, but others were dispatched to the mainland to draw the laurel and the rose from the banks of the Brenta. Inanimate nature seemed to partake in the joy and triumph of man, and a bright and exhilarating sun, a gay blue sky, a sea serene, and a breeze as gentle as the sigh of happy love, were propitious to Venice and her day of rejoicing. Meanwhile the fleet came on, spread out into the figure of a crescent. Every ship was distinctly visible through that fine transparent atmosphere, and as they glided over the placid waters toward their place of rest, the appropriate banner of each was clearly seen, and the impatient citizens on shore could tell the particular galley in which had sailed the sun, a brother or a friend? There is the Stella, cried an old man, my own brave boy commands there. And there the Speranza, cried another, and God be praised, my Francesco's flag still floats on her masthead. Exclamations like these, and the eloquent outpourings of natural affection were heard every moment to proceed from the congregated thousands, while the speaking faces, the expressive Italian countenances there collected, offered to the eye a picture on which the artist might have dwelt with apprehension and delight. The fleet was now so near that the sounds of their warlike music were heard, and every detail, to use the language of the painter, was distinctly made out. The bright painted shields of the returning knights and squires were arranged on either side of the galleys. The warriors stood on the deck in their armour of mail, with the silver inlaid morion on their heads and the burnished arms in their hands. The broad lance, the battle axe, and the steel-tipped mace threw back the rays of the sun with dazzling brightness. The winged lion, the standard of the Republic, flew over their heads. The bannerets of the patrician families of Venice floated on the elevated stern quarter of the ships, while the principal galley, which had borne the blind old Dandolo to the scene of his glory, was distinguished by a vast white banner, on which was inscribed in letters of gold the new, the proud, the singular but accurate title of Lord of 3/8 of the Roman Empire, assumed by the conquering Doge, and afterward retained by the Venetian Republic. The instruments of the musicians, of which only the more clangus, as the cymbal or the trumpet had at first been heard, now were all mingled and audible. With each passing moment they waxed louder and louder, until they burst on the ear with an overpowering peal, an air of war and triumph, to which the voices of the warriors and mariners formed an accompaniment. Then there rose to heaven a shout from those on shore that made Venice to ring through her 100 islets, and the cymbal and the harp, the shrill trumpet, the spirit-stirring drum, the ear-piercing fife, gave back a response to the galleys that, gilded by the sun and reflected by the waters, now first approached land. On shore, as on the sea, the spectacle was imposing. Venice, indeed, was not yet the splendid city that claimed the world's admiration. She could not yet boast that accumulation of ancient and modern art which was afterward to attract the stranger from many a distant land. But so early as this, or at the commencement of the 13th century, Venice was a city of importance, as remarkable as she ever could be, from her peculiar situation, even beautiful and stately, if compared with the cities, her contemporaries, in any other part of the world than Italy. The Campanile, or lofty tower of St. Mark, did not yet pierce the clouds, nor did the temple then offer to the observer's eye that striking mixture of Greek and Saracenic architecture, those long extending rows of arches, that forest of columns, all of precious marble, those beautiful mosaics, and that general richness and vastness which resulted from after ages of commerce, wealth, and genius. But the bones of the blessed apostle of the evangelist, whose name, says a Venetian historian, is associated with all the glories of the Republic, had reposed there ever since the 8th century, and the devotion of the Venetians had raised over those sacred relics an edifice vast in dimensions, and not destitute of beauty. The obelisks of granite and the elaborately sculptured pillars stood not yet in the piazza or the piazzetta. The horses of bronze, those obsequious followers in the train of victory, those records of the mutability of fortune, stood not yet over the door of the temple, though they were soon to be there, for it was this returning fleet that brought them as a trophy from captured Constantinople. In fine, Egypt and Syria, Greece and the Isles of Greece, had not yet been conquered and despoiled of their glorious remains to ornament the proud sea Cybele. But at the same time some objects of art and antiquity had been imported, some improvement from the study of them had been introduced in architecture and sculpture, and Italian genius had destined in after time to rival that of Hellas, had begun to dawn, and Italian taste to show itself in the construction of their habitations, their churches, and public edifices. It might be said, perhaps, that at the epoch of our tale Venice was about, equidistant from what she was at her humble origin, a collection of low huts scattered on the sea-lashed sandbanks and rocks, whose poor inhabitants, Cassiodorus, the minister of Theodoric, compared to waterfowl who had fixed their nests on the bosom of the waves, and what she became after the 16th century, when the wealth of the East had been poured in her lap, and the genius of Palladio and others had filled her with beauty. But the moral picture offered to Venice at that period was perhaps far more interesting and worthy of admiration. In Venice the art and spirit of commercial industry had revived, and was then extending its pre-Arian arms to every shore of the Mediterranean. On the perilous career of conquest she had entered with great éclat, and considering her origin and position, the influence she exercised on the politics of the south and east of Europe was astonishing. The banners of 3 subject nations did not yet float before St. Mark's, but an emperor had knelt there, a pope had been the guest of the Republic, and his gratitude had invested Venice with the nuptial ring with which on each succeeding year she was to espouse the Adriatic, which she was to wear as the absolute mistress and sovereign of the seas. The glorious dawn of liberty among the neighbours of Venice, the Lombard cities, that dawn that was destined never to reach its meridian splendour, but to expire in the night of a despicable and enduring slavery, was even then a faint light compared to that which emanated from the liberal institutions of the Republic, where a hard-hearted oligarchy, anxious indeed for the glory of the state, but indifferent to human suffering and crime, had not yet seized absolute power, nor sent its victims in mystery across the bridge of sighs. The city of the Isles might at this period be compared to a hero still young, had gallantly advanced on the career of glory, whose aspirations were lofty, whose shield was not bedimmed with blood, who had not yet acquired and abused, alas, why should one be consequent on the other, extensive and uncontrolled power, to whose future successes one might look with confidence, and we, at the distance of centuries, may also partake in the enthusiasm of the old chroniclers who record the triumph of her conquering son's return from Constantinople. The Piazzetta, which is situated by the side of the church of St. Mark, then contained the principal edifices of the Republic, and it was here the knights and the captains of the galleys that had now come to anchor close to the quay, descended by stairs and platforms prepared for them, and covered with laurels and flowers, banners and silks of Tyrian dye, and it was here their anxious feet again touched their native soil, and their relatives and friends received them to their passionate embrace. As one by one they stepped on shore, the people rent the air with their exclamations. The seigneurs of the Republic, in an open balcony, bowed to them as a herald repeated their distinguished names, while the bands of music pealed the notes of triumph, and the fair daughters of Venice looked and smiled a welcome. The general picture of joy and grief there was in the midst of all these rejoicings, for many returned not to bless the eyes of affection, but remained in the country they had conquered, and many had sped to those regions whence there is no return. This general picture would be far too vast even to be sketched here, and thus we will attach ourselves to the fortunes and feelings of one who figured in this day's pageantry. Gherardo was the only son of the patrician Zani, and the most gallant youth of Venice. His love of military glory must have been great, for when the Doge, the incomparable Enrico Dandolo, invited him to follow his banner to the east, he was betrothed to Bianca Celsi, as distinguished for her beauty as he for his valour. Yet on the threshold of the hymeneal temple he did not hesitate. He would go where glory and his countrymen summoned him. When the Doge's exploits were achieved, he would return to Venice, and more deserving of her, lay the laurels at the feet of his young bride. He had prospered, Constantinople had witnessed his valour, and now returned, the Piazzetta echoed with the name of Gherardo. He had received the embraces of his aged father, without alarm at his tears, for overwrought joy will weep even as sorrow does. He had been pressed in the arms of the friends of his house in his infancy, and he now advanced to a gentler circle, composed of his female relatives and friends, who, stationed at a balcony, murmured the hero's name and his welcome back to Venice. But what means this omission? Bianca was not among them. Bianca, his spouse, was not there to welcome him with eye and tongue. His voice trembled as he hurriedly asked where she was. An inconsiderate and cruel voice in the crowd answered, "Bianca is no more. She sleeps with her father in the church of St. Theodore." "No more?" moaned the young warrior, and his flushed face became pale as monumental marble, and but for his friends he had fallen to the earth like one struck by lightning. When he partially recovered from the first shock, he again raised his eyes to the lady's balcony. She was indeed not there. Where she must have been had life and love animated her. That absence confirmed the truth of the ill-omened voice. His eyes dropped despondingly to the earth, where, now in his youth and his glory, he could have wished to see a grave open for himself. His old father fell on his neck and wept aloud. For some moments the mind of Gherardo wandered, and his soul was benumbed, but the sight of Alessio, the brother of Bianca, advancing through the crowd, recalled him to consciousness and anguish. "Is it even as they say?" cried he hoarsely, and stretching out his hand to his friend. Alessio grasped his hand with one of his, and dashing away the tears from his averted face with the other, he replied in a suffocated voice, "Alas, alas, it is even so. Bianca expired yesterday, and as the galley, your precursor, was appearing, my sister was on her road to the sepulchre." Such irremediable woe, where so much bliss was expected, such an awakening from all the ecstatic dreams and aspirations that had given him strength in battle and cheered him over the tedious and stormy waves, such a return, such a welcome, such an end to all his fond and passionate hopes, was not to be supported. With a deep groan he swooned away, and the young hero, so lately the happiest among the happy, the most animated where all were animated, was borne in a lifeless state to the sad halls of his father. It was long ere he returned to life and reason, and oh, how dreadful was his return to the latter! He would have given the world for some opiate or drug capable of repelling thought and recollection. He closed his eyes to the gay light of the sun. He would have shut out its rays for ever. He was deaf to the assiduous advice and consolation of his friends who thronged about him. He was mute, too, and asked not a single question as to the malady or disease of his bride. Was it not enough to know that she was for ever torn from him? Dead! What mattered the mode or the circumstances that had led to such a fearful result? At last he spoke, but it was only to request his father that he might be left alone. The afflicted signor, with words of affectionate condolence, and prayers that his son would raise his thoughts to the contemplation of that being in whose hands were life and death, and to whose omnipotent will it was duty to submit, left the room with tears, and was followed by all the company. When, in the silence and solitude of his own chamber, Gherardo looked around him, he felt more than ever the extent of his loss. He rose from the couch on which he had been reclining, and advanced to a curtained recess at the end of the room. He drew the curtains. The sight was a cruel one. There was the talamo, or splendid nuptial bed, his friends had prepared and decorated for his return. There, on the rich velvet and the flowing silk, were the embroidered rose wreaths mixed with the laurel crowns, and the initials of his name entwined with those of the name of his Bianca. And hungry death was feeding on her roses, and her name in the mouths of men had become a note of woe in his ear, a sound of despair. He threw himself on the ground at the bed's foot, and burying his burning face in his hands, gave vent for the first time to a copious flood of tears. As thus he lay, humbled in the dust, with all his thoughts in the dark and narrow grave, the sun shone brightly on Venice, and her thronging thousands, replete with joy, sang their songs of triumph, and shouted the names of their gallant warriors and captains of their galleys. It could not be that his should be forgotten, for who had borne himself more bravely than he? And as a crowd passed in front of his paternal abode, their united voices proclaimed Gherardo, Gherardo, long life and glory to Gherardo, the soldier of St. Mark. The sounds struck his ears, but now they could elicit only a bitter smile. The passing hours did not restore tranquillity to the bereft bridegroom, but as the shades of night descended, a wild idea, an uncontrollable impulse, invaded him. And shall my fond eyes obtain not a glance of that being of love and beauty? Shall my Bianca, reasoned the passionate youth, if such movement of the feelings can be called reason, my betrothed, be consumed by vile worms, and I not see the loveliness she must have carried to the grave? She died but yesterday, must still be beautiful. Yes, I will see her once again. I will once again press those lips, though they be cold. Cold. At a late hour he secretly left his father's house for the well-known church. Alas, he was to have been married there. A handful of gold gained over the sacristano, who unlocked the door of the temple and retired. Gherardo stood alone, a few paces from Bianca's tomb. A few lamps burned here and there dimly before the effigies of the Virgin Mother and of the more conspicuous saints. The moon shed an uncertain light through the painted glass of the lofty and narrow Gothic windows, but away among the massy columns and through the long aisles of the church there fell the obscurity of the valley of the shadow of death, and sounds there were none save the fast-coming sighs of the hapless lover. The hour, the spot, the awful stillness were all calculated to overpower the mind with indescribable emotion. The age was one of extreme superstition, and our young soldier's philosophy had not taught him to rise superior to the popular credence. The state of his feelings, too, and nothing is more imaginative or creative of ideal horrors than a certain stage of grief, contributed to delude the senses, and as the cresset trembled in the moonlight, strangely coloured by the stained glass through which it passed, gleamed now brighter and now fainter, now resting on this object of somewhat grotesque architecture of the church, now on that, he saw or fancied the spirits of the departed rising one by one and mournfully waving their hands, as if warning him against sacrilegious intrusion on the regions of the dead. Through the postern door by which he had entered, and which the sacristano had left ajar, there suddenly blew a gust of the fresh night breeze, that, moaning among the columns and over the hollow marble pavement of the church, sounded in his ear like a voice, but not of earth, like the united lamentations of sad or guilt-burdened spirits. He clung to one of the pillars for support, and was for some moments incapable of motion. His natural courage and the intenseness of the feeling and purpose that had brought him thither soon, however, came to his aid, and he strode with hasty steps to the capella, or lateral recess of the temple, beneath which was the tomb of his bride's family. Here, in this deep recess, the moon could not shed a beam, but he was guided to the door of the sepulchre by a lamp that flickered on the altar, or capella. Hurried, breathless, he laid his hand upon that door, massy and bound with heavy iron and with bronze. It required a great effort to open it. He pressed his muscular shoulder against it. It receded, but as it turned on its unwilling hinges, it produced a hoarse rumbling sound that echoed like thunder in the vault beneath, and caused him to start back with trembling limbs and cold sweat on his brow. Again, however, desperation, love, the determination to see the lifeless form of his beloved, conquered his awe and the repugnance for disturbing the peace of the grave. Yet he paused ere he plunged into the horrible, palpable obscurity that lay beyond the door of the tomb, and crossing himself, murmured a prayer to the Blessed Virgin, who saw his woe, and might pity or pardon his sacrilegious audacity. He then rushed down a few steps through a short, dark passage, and himself, like a spectre, entered the narrow chamber of death. A lamp beneath a crucifix burned at the head of the avello, or sarcophagus of Bianca, and a grated window near the roof the vault admitted the rays of the moon that fell almost perpendicularly on that cold white marble. He grasped at once the heavy cover of the coffin. Had he hesitated, he might have been effectually deterred from completing his sad, wild enterprise. His nervous arms removed the weight, and then his eyes rested on the shrouded form of his Bianca, whose head was enveloped in a veil of pure white, and her decent limbs composed beneath an ample white robe. His brain reeled at the sight, and the lamp which he had grasped fell from his hand. When he recovered strength to proceed, the light from the grated window fell full in the open coffin, and as his trembling hands withdrew the veil, a clear, broad ray of the moon illumined the face of his lovely bride. And could this be death? Why, even thus she looked when life and love coursed through her young veins, even thus when after a day of joy she slept a balmy sleep, a night of peace, and were not the long, loose tresses crossed on her innocent bosom the same as erst, and the pale smooth brow, and the broad eyelids with their long black fringes, and the cherub mouth with lips slightly apart, as if smiling in some blissful dream? No, this cannot be death, cried Gherardo deliriously. She sleeps, she only sleeps. Oh, wake! In pity, wake, my Bianca, my love, my wife. He was silent for a moment, and gazed on her beautiful moonlit countenance, as if expecting she would really rise at his passionate adjuration. Bianca, continued he, my own Bianca, why dost thou slumber thus? Dost thou await the warm kisses of thy lover to awaken thee? I give them thee. And throwing himself across the marble coffin, he pressed his quivering lips to hers. But how did his whole soul rush to his mouth when he fancied he felt the breath of life on those pale lips? He pressed them again. If it was delusion, it continued, for the mildest, the most subdued of breathings seemed to pass from her lips to his. He raised her from the sarcophagus. He placed his hand on her heart, and language has no power to paint his emotions when he felt, plainly felt, that heart palpitate beneath his hand. Another moment, and her eyes opened, while a low murmur escaped her lips. Gherardo clasped her wildly in his embrace, and leaned for support against the sarcophagus, where, as they stood, mute, motionless, and pale, almost like statues in the moonlight, it would have been difficult to tell which of the two, or whether both, had not been awakened from the sleep of death. Chronicler's tale is told. The ignorance of the physicians and the immediate sepulture after death, usual in the South, had consigned Bianca to the grave, from which the passion and impetuosity of her lover saved her so opportunely. The fair Venetian passed almost at once from the marble sarcophagus to the nuptial bed of silk and velvet, the church, where the echoes of her funeral dirge might almost seem yet to linger, pealed with the notes of her hymeneals, and her bridal coronet of white roses was supplied by the tree that had furnished flowers for her funeral. End of section 6.
Section 7 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tasha Mapes. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 5, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 7, Spring. And now stern winter o'er his daughter spring half smiling bends, and from her lovely face, with cautious hand as fearful to awake the sleeping beauty from her trance too soon, the snowy veil removes, and see the nymph slowly arises from her verdant couch, while nature with one general burst of joy hails her return. Man owns her influence too. The frozen fount of fancy gushes from his heart anew, and many a sportive thought, that midst the gloom of cheerless winter all neglected lay, like some forgotten wildflower, blooms again. End of section 7.
Section 8 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Aidan Fitzgerald. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 5. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 8. Lacy de Vere. Doomed to be the last leaf, which by heaven's decree must hang upon a blasted tree. Wordsworth. The founder of the family of the De Veres came over with the first William, but not as an adventurer allured by the prospect of gain and the hope of acquiring titular distinction, for the insignia of knighthood had already been bestowed upon him in his own land. When, however, the conquest rendered it alike the duty and policy of William to attach his Norman followers to his person, Rupert de Vere was one of the first who received solid proofs of that monarch's favor. Generation followed generation, king after king succeeded to the throne. Centuries of change, romance and tragedy fulfilled their checkered fate. And in the history of all, the De Veres were eminently conspicuous. But time that lifts the low and level lays the lofty brow began at length to exercise an evil influence on the fortune of the house, and toward the middle of the 15th century, Hugh, the then Baron de Vere, had little to transmit to his children, beyond the name and the noble nature of his ancestors. Instead of the broad manors and princely dwellings once connected with the title, he found himself reduced to a single castle, situated on the sea-coast in the north of England, one that in the proud days of the family had been erected as a mere hold for the protection of the northern vessels from the insurrections of the Scottish borders. At the period in question, the War of the Roses, those suicidal wars of the same people, were at their height. Every county became in turn a field of battle, till the whole kingdom was saturated with the blood of its habitants. The ties of neighborhood, even of kindred, were dissolved. Inhabitants of the same village, members of one household, separated only to meet again in the hatred and bloodthirstiness, only to reunite in the fierce onset of battle. Neighbors as strangers, friends as rivals, children of one mother as sworn foes. Though it was in consequence of these wars that the family of the De Veres became extinct. From one sorrow and one disgrace they were free. They neither espoused the cause of rebellion, nor were they divided among themselves. At the first raising of King Henry's standard, the old baron braced on his armor, and if owing to the changed fortunes of his house, many went forth to the service of that monarch with a larger train of vessels, not one, whether prince or knight, could compete with Hugh de Vere in the value of his offering. He brought with him 6 brave sons, devoted to him and to each other, the pillars of his house, the guardians of his age. Even the youngest, the fair stripling Lacy, girt with the sword which his father, when himself a youth, had wielded at Agincourt. He too was there, stately in step and bold of heart, as the mailed man of 100 battles. That was neither a time nor a court calculated to encourage tenderness of heart, and she, the guiding spirit of both, was little subject to its influence. Yet, as the baron presented his sons, each after each according to his age, an expression of sorrow passed for an instant over the countenance of Queen Margaret. When Lacy stepped from the circle and kneeled down, "Nay, nay, my lord," she said hastily, "leave the boy behind. Why expose a life that can benefit neither friend nor foe? Rise, rise, poor child. What canst thou do for us?" "I can die," said the noble boy, with a passionate enthusiasm that thrilled his father's heart, with mingled pride and sorrow. "Well said," replied the queen, fixing her cold, proud eye on Lacy's countenance, yet glowing with emotion. He understood its meaning, and returned the searching glance with something like an expression of indignant defiance. "I perceive he is a de Vere," said the Queen, turning to the old Baron, for whom the compliment and its accompanying smile were intended. "But where is poor Blanche?" continued she, addressing Lacy. "If thou hast left her in the north, she too may need a knight's protection. Thou art a brave spirit, but dost thou well to leave her in charge of hirelings? For her sake, for thine own, peril not thy youth and our cause. Lord Hugh, command him back to thy castle. If Warwick keep court in the north, he may chance to see fighting even there." This was no common strain with Margaret of Anjou, but her own princely boy, the magnanimous, ill-fated Edward, stood beside her, and the woman and the mother triumphed for an instant over the imperious and dark-minded queen. "Craving your grace's favour," said Lacy in a determined tone, before his father had time to reply. "Were Blanche my wife instead of my sister, I would neither live nor die like a bird in a cage. When the arrow finds me," and the boy pointed as he spoke to his device, a falcon in full flight, "it shall be thus, free and fearless." No farther expostulation or entreaty was attempted. Lacy accompanied his father and brothers, and ere time had written manhood on his brow. He had borne his part in many a well-fought field. The various changes in the royal fortunes are, however, too well known to require enumeration here. Indeed, except as connected with the fortunes of Lacy de Vere, they are irrelevant. On him and his they told so soon and so fatally, that at the period to which this legend is supposed to refer, he was no longer the fair stripling who had vowed to die before he well knew the nature of death. The years that had elapsed since then were, it is true, few in number, but they had been years of strife and storm, crowded with fearful alternations of victory and defeat, flight and pursuit, alike grievous and unavailing. The great struggle was yet undecided. Lacy de Vere was still a youth warrior, but oh, how changed, how careworn! The bloom had forsaken his cheek, buoyancy had left his spirit. Prompt in fight and cool in counsel, he played his part in the desperate game like one to whom life and death, success and failure, were alike uncertain and indifferent. And to him all things else were changed. He no longer rode forth encouraged by the presence of his father and 5 brave brothers. One by one that little company was cut off. Each after each, in the order of birth, fell by his side, and he, the youngest of his father's house, became its head, the sole heir of a race of heroes, the last Baron de Vere. It was the Battle of Taunton which invested Lacy with these melancholy honors, and rendered him at the same time a fugitive. For that battle, so sanguinary in itself, was fatal to the Queen and her adherents. Stung to madness by the death of his latest surviving brother, and the utter ruin of that cause, in defiance of which all that was dear to him had perished, the words of Margaret, the tears of Blanche, rushed upon his memory. That tie of kindred which he once so lightly esteemed, now that it was the only one remaining, assumed its rightful sway over his wounded spirit. He found that the relative love which God hath planted in the human heart, however it may be outraged for a time by stoicism, by worldly wisdom, or worldly glory, will return to the proudest bosom in the dark day of adversity. Lacy de Vere was once in the delirium of martial pride, scorned his home, and deserted her who, as the offspring of the same birth, was bound to him by more than common sisterhood. now flung down the insignia of his rank and bearing, and fled from the field of battle. True to that instinct which governs all men in their misfortunes, he fled toward his long-deserted home, and he found it, as his fears had well predicted, desolate and in ruins. One horrible peculiarity in the present contest was the license assumed by both parties to devastate whatever part of the country they passed through, whether hostile or friendly to their interests. Even those engaged in the same cause were not always safe from each other. Many an old feud was avenged, many a rival removed, or his property destroyed, apparently by some excess on the part of the troops, but frequently at the command of their more interested leaders. The devastation which had been wrought in the present instance seemed more than the result of destroyers animated by merely general motives. There appeared to have been a guided spirit at work. There did not remain sufficient building to shelter a beggar from the storm. Not a tree, not a shrub, but was cut down or mutilated. The grass and corn had been consumed with fire as they stood. Even paltry hovels, which sheltered the domestic laborers, were leveled with the earth. All was destroyed without distinction or remorse, destroyed in the spirit of hatred. Lacy de Vere walked around the remains of this, the last hold of his race, and in the anguish of a noble spirit, brought low by self-reproach, he rejoiced that his father and brothers were in the grave. But when he had reached a spot which had once been a little herb garden, carefully walled round, now open on all sides, and choked with the drifted sea sand, rage and grief overcame him. He could no longer refrain from the expression of his inward emotions. "Yes," said he with a bitter smile, "yes, an enemy hath done this, but no enemy of King Henry and his cause. It was no Robin of Redesdale with his marauders, no vindictive Warwick, no savage borderers. My enemy, the enemy of my house, Lionel Wethamstead. Thou'st did this evil. Assassin serpent, twice I spared thee in battle, and twice didst thou ride off bidding me seek my flourishing home and fair sister. Blind fool to cherish a tiger till it longed for its keeper's blood. Lionel Withamstead," continued the speaker more vehemently, while his whole frame was tremulous with passion. "Didst thou slaughter the lamb in the fold? Was the bird crushed in the nest? O Lionel, if thou didst spare Blanche in the day of destruction, all were thy sins thousandfold shall be forgiven. If Blanche lives, if thou hadst spared her, I, even I, thine enemy, will bless thee." Lacy was too engrossed by his emotions to be aware that he was watched, or even observed, by a boy couched among the rubbish. At first glance, the intruder appeared nothing more than a young peasant, worn with fright and famine. But upon a second view, his attire, coarse as it were, could not disguise the natural grace of the wearer, nor even the dark cloth bonnet, though only of the kind worn by menials, gave a sordid expression to the noble countenance which it shaded. Hitherto he had remained perfectly quiet, eyeing Lacy with mingled anxiety and interest. But when the last words of the young knight's passionate invocation died upon the air, he rose from his hiding-place with a slow and stately step, and addressed him in a tone that struck like the east wind to the listener's heart, a tone of reproach, if aught so sweet could be said to convey reproach, of affection and deep sorrow. "And where wert thou, Lacy de Vere, when the spoiler stole upon thy heritage? Where was thy care when she for whom thou mourn'st prayed thee by that mystery of love, which unites those born in the same hour, to stay and shield her from treachery and violence? And didst thou spare Lionel Withamstead? look to it. For of a truth in the day of his power, not so will he spare thee. Look to it, for he hath vowed vengeance against all who bear thy name, and all who call thee master. But few, few are those. He hath begun his work well. Think ye not he will finish? When thou wert young, thou hatedst him, for the lying lip and craven spirit are hateful to the brave and true. But he saw it, he withered in the scornful glances of thy dark eye. And he swore to have vengeance, slow, secret, but sure vengeance on thee and thine. He hath it, groaned Lacy. He hath it to the last drop of bitterness. He hath it not, resumed the boy solemnly. Dost not thou the offender live? And she who spurned him as a reptile when he proffered her safety in his hand. Look to it, last of a lordly race, spare him not the third time. He hath laid thy dwelling in the dust. Those who were hirelings he corrupted, those who were faithful he slew, and she who was born to mate with princes fled for her life to the dark and noisome cavern of the rock. Yet is the work of vengeance incomplete. Weep on, Lacy de Vere, continued the mysterious speaker, after a pause only interrupted by the Baron's convulsive sobs. Though thou art a warrior, weep on. What knowest thou of grief? It hath come to thee in its royal robes, amid sounding trumpets and gorgeous banners, and the shout of victory, and the presence of mighty warriors. But grief hath come to me in lowlier guise, in darkness and cold, and neglect, and hunger, and sickness of heart, and loneliness of the grave. And I shall weep no more, unless perchance for thee. Curse me, Blanche, said Lacy vehemently, for his heart told him that she herself was by his side. I can bear all things now. I have found thee. And saying this, he drew her to his bosom, and wept over her like a child. Further details of the conversation which ensued on the reunion of those who had been so long been lost to each other are needless. Love is a child that sparks in broken words. It is easy to conceive of the self-reproaches uttered by Lacy, and the sweet forgiveness and consolation spoken by Blanche. Of the anxious question and fond reply, their mutual mourning over the past, and mutual cares for the future, both softened by the reflection that, come weal, come woe, the bound of affection would never be more divided. They needed neither vow nor witness, yet there, amid the ruins of that home, which had sheltered them throughout a happy childhood, on the hearthstone round which for centuries their ancestors had gathered, the twins, the last of their race, knelt down and vowed to separate no more, but to have living or dying one home, one grave, and they called upon the spirits of their father and brethren, whose bones lay bleaching on many a field of battle, to witness and sanctify their vow. They arose, homeless and friendless. Nevertheless, they arose comforted, for that love, which neither change nor sorrow can lastingly embitter or absorb, again triumphed in the soul of each. The refuge which Blanche had found for herself on the destruction of her home and the death or flight of those left to guard it was too fearful a spot to have been selected by one less courageous, or under circumstances less appalling. A line of rock extended along the seashore for about the space of half a mile, gradually rising from one extremity and as gradually declining to the other. It appeared one vast parapet, a continued range of stone battlements, erected by nature, at once to overlook and brave the ocean beneath. The front was as completely perpendicular as if hewn by the hammer and the chisel, while lichens, mosses, ivory of every variety of graceful creeping shrub overspread its surface, as though trained there by the hand of man. It was wonderful to view what seemed a gigantic wall of cold, hard stone, thus magnificently embroidered with the foliage of earth, while here and there messes of orrery and weather-strained rock showed like ruined castles amid the cleaning greenery. Nearly at the summit of the highest point, inaccessible as it would seem except to the sea-bird and the goat, was a natural arch, scooped out of the rock and opening into a cavern. The ivy spread around that arch with peculiar beauty. Adjacent parts of the rock brightened in the beam of morning or in the moonlight, but the cavern always retained the same aspect, dark, noisome, unearthly. This was Blanche's refuge, the dwelling place of her who had been delicately reared, been befitted the only daughter of a noble house. Lacy was mute with surprise and terror when he first saw her ascend what appeared to him as inaccessible to the foot as any castle wall. There were, however, though he perceived them not, inequalities on the surface, and now clinging to a brush, now grasping a root of ivory, her nailed peasant's shoes tinkling at every step against the stony path, her slight figure alternately hidden and revealed amongst the shrubs. Blanche, to whom habit had familiarized the perilous ascent, reached the cavern, but as she stood in the dark entrance, the moonlight glimmering on her countenance, and her voice coming down from the vast height a mere filament of sound, Lacy could have believed her a creature of another world and species. She was not, however, companionless in this aerial home. The goats often repaired thither to rest. The sea-bird there deposited her eggs, and to them she had frequently been indebted for sustenance, when the rock and the shore failed to afford their natural tribute of berries and shellfish. Necessity, that teacher sterner and more efficient even than duty, soon accustomed Lacy to the difficult ascent and rude hiding-place. He had been too familiar with hardship and sorrow to mourn over outward privations, and ere long he loved that dim retreat, hallowed as it was by repose and safety, and cheered by the presence of her who was not only his sister, but his best and only friend. The desires which once consumed his spirit were extinguished. The vain strife, and the yet vainer joys and ambitions of the world no longer occupied his mind. Revenge and all ferocious thoughts were dead. He could remember his enemies, aye, even Lionel Withamstead, in peace, and when he walked among the neighboring herdsmen, lowlier in lot than themselves, or stood in the opening of his mountain hold, and looked on the ocean roaring beneath, or the host of heaven shining quietly above, Lacy de Vere forgot the past, and calling his sister to his side, pronounced himself a happy man. But this retreat, this respite from misfortune, was not destined to remain long undiscovered. The Battle of Taunton had, it is true, placed Edward, Duke of York, on the throne, and wholly destroyed or scattered the adherents of Queen Margaret. But that remorseless prince, deeming his power only to be secured by continued bloodshed, still allowed his followers to ravish the north, as having been the stronghold of the Lancastrian cause. Among the most active in this murderous employment was Lionel Withamstead. He knew that Lacy de Vere yet lived, concealed, as he had reason to suspect, in the neighborhood of his former dwelling. Except as affording means of gaining fortune and distinction, the cause of King Edward or Queen Margaret were alike indifferent to him. It was personal hatred which induced him to hunt out the Lancastrians with such relentless zeal, the desire to discover and exterminate the last of that family, whose protection he had so long enjoyed and cruelly requited. During childhood and youth he had been a favorite with the old Baron de Vere, and as such allowed to be intimate with the castle. Before him he had masked, under the show of humility and devoted zeal, the designing, treacherous spirit which crouches that it may be more securely spring at its prey, and lays in servile submission the foundation of despotic power. The young Lacy, bold and open as became his birth, instinctively scorned the minion, even before he discovered how well that scorn was merited. Many a proud glance and bitter taunt were bestowed by the fearless youth, little dreaming that of which, however, unnoticed at the time, Lionel kept a too faithful record, and would one day claim for them a deadly recompense. And now that day was near at hand. Hatred, once formed in the heart, turns neither to the right hand nor the left till its work is done. Love, even the love of a mother for her babe, may be diverted. Grief, though of a father for his firstborn be forgotten, gratitude may pass like the morning dew, and pity as a noonday cloud. Hatred alone can survive all change, all time, all circumstance. All other emotions, nay. It can survive the accomplishment of revenge, and like the vampire, prey on its dead victim. "I know not," said Lacy, as he and Blanche stood together one evening in the archway of their cavern. "I know not why, when all around me is so fair, sadness and forebodings of coming evil should hang so heavily on my heart." "Nay, nay, dear Lacy," replied Blanche. "Look at our castle, which will resist both fire and violence. Our faithful rock, with all its luxuriant graniture flashing in the light of that departing sun. What should we fear? Art thou weary of repose, Lacy, or dost thou mistrust thy warder?" continued she with affectionate playfulness, at the same instant placing her arm around his. But the cloud passed not from her brother's brow, and he replied in a low, broken voice men use when troubled in spirit. "I tell thee, Blanche, nay, count not my words idle, for an influence is on me which I can neither gainsay nor resist. I tell thee, evil hangs over us, my end is near. Twice I spared Lionel Wethamstead, and twice since the last going down of yonder sun have I beheld myself in his power. Oh, it was a dark vision, a dream more fearful than a field of battle." "Dreams, Lacy, visions, what of them? When I dwelt here alone, oh, how often did I see thee prisoner, wounded, dying, dead! I too had dreams and visions, yet they came not true. Why then should thine?" Lacy made no reply to this inquiry, for he heard it not, and when he again spoke, his words were but the expression of the melancholy reverie into which he had fallen. Yes, it was down there, stealing along the foot of the rock, half hidden by the trees and underwood, Lionel and his black band, 6 blackened spirits as in outward guise, not one ever known to strike twice or to spare. I knew them all, and why they came. "Lacy, Baron de Vere!" exclaimed Blanche, shaking his arm, which she held with her utmost strength. "Rouse from this unmanly mood. Let the babe and the peasant stare at shadows. But thou, I pray thee, let me not have to blush for him whom I ought to honor." "And whom thou wilt ere long weep," replied Lacy in an unaltered voice. "Blanche de Vere, misjudge me not. I spoke neither of flight nor fear, nor supplication for life, nor aught that may disgrace a warrior. I did not but speak of death. Death that were welcome, if it came only to myself, but my sister, dearer than all the kindred I have lost, or all now living, my last friend, death, is on its way to thee too." "It will not be death if shared with thee," replied Blanche fervently. "Death would be to live when thou wert gone. I did thee wrong, noble, generous brother. forgive it." And she sat down at his feet and covered her face with her hands. "Glorious orb," said Lacy, after having for some minutes earnestly regarded the sun, which was now slowly descending into the ocean with more than meridian pump. "Unchanged, unchangeable, bright at thy setting as on thy first rising. Most glorious orb, farewell. And thou to earth, steeping in the tears and blood of thy children, polluted with crime, groaning with sorrow, yet withal so beauteously apparelled. Many graves hast thou afforded my father's house. Spare it yet another, the last, and now," said he, the steady solemn tone in which he had hitherto spoke changing to one of indignant defiance, while a change as complete overspread his countenance. "Now, even now that grave is needed, the appointed hour is arrived. Yonder the murderers come, black and silent as in the vision, but the Lacy de Vere dies not like a reptile, driven into its hold and crushed in darkness. The doom that is decreed shall be met. Rise, Blanche, sister by birth, companion in sorrow, daughter of heroes, arise, and let us descend. Let not Lionel have to glory in our shame. Haste, haste! I see his black plume waving to and fro. His spear glitters through the trees, nearer, brighter every instant." "I am ready, ready to endure all," said Blanche firmly. "But oh, let not Lionel see our parting anguish. Bless me for the last time here." And she laid her head upon her brother's bosom. They stood regarding each other, speechless and in tears. To part was harder than to die. Lacy's vision of forebodings were indeed on the point of being realized. The implacable Lionel had learned but too surely their place of retreat, and but too truly was he with his ruffians, winding along the foot of the rock. Even now they were within view of the cavern, in the opening which stood that devoted pair, whose doom was sealed before they knew it. A shout of brutal triumph suddenly arose from Lionel and his band, as they halted when sufficiently near the spot. At the same instant 2 picked archers obeyed their leader's command with murderous precision, and ere the defenseless victims could look round or utter a cry, the arrows pierced them, clasped as they were in each other's arms. One of the shafts had entered Lacy's heart, and in the twinkling of an eye, without a word or a groan, he was numbered with the dead. For an instant, a single instant, his dying eyes were turned upon his fellow victim, and at that glance, though transient as the flash of lightning, revealed love stronger than death, love that would exist beyond the grave. The wound received by Blanche, though mortal, was not calculated to occasion instant death, and nobly did she employ the precious respite. "My brother shall not become a prey to the birds of the air," were her first words on perceiving that he was indeed dead, and with an energy scarcely human, she prepared for her labor of love. Habit had, it is true, rendered the ascent and descent of that rock so easy that in the darkest night she would scarcely have missed her footing. But wounded as she was at present, her intention to descend and convey with her Lacy's yet warm and bleeding body appeared impracticable. Love, however, enabled her to execute what love had induced her to determine. Carefully wrapping the corse in every garment she could afford from herself, to defend it in some measure from the sharp points of the rock, she partly drew and partly bore the precious burden down a pathway which to any but herself, when under such circumstances, have surely been fatal. She felt neither fatigue nor pain. She heeded not that every stone and step in her descent was sprinkled with her own blood. Her sole care was to shield the senseless body in her arms from wounds and injury. Heaven in pity strengthened her for the task, and she reached the ground in safety, her labor accomplished, her reward obtained. Those who had come out against the noble pair gathered round them in silence, some in truth touched by the exhibition of love, passing even the love of women. She unfolded the coverings from the body, which was now becoming cold and stiff. Then looking upon the armed circle, she fixed her eye on him, the evil spirit whose ministers they were, and addressed him like one gifted with unearthly authority. "Lionel, thy work is finished. Thou wert the nursling of our house, and hast become its destroyer. Thou hast rendered bitter for sweet, evil for good, and injuries for benefits. Thou hast brought low the old, the honorable, the young, the brave, the virtuous, and hitherto none hath stayed thy hand. But come near, Lionel Withamstead, and I will advise thee of things that shall befall thee yet. By day thou shalt dread treachery, and by night dream visions of horror. Thou shalt flee when none pursue, and be afraid where no fear is. Thou hast built thy fortunes in thy master's blood. Some around thee shall build theirs and thine. As thou hast hated, so shall others hate thee. Scorn and sorrow and affliction and want, every evil thou hast wrought on us, cleave fourfold, and forever to thee and thine. Yea, cleave as the flesh cleaveth to the bone. Ay, go thy way, man of blood. Brace thy helmet and mount thy steed. Thou mayest escape me now, but I shall see thee again, where neither horse nor armor shall avail thee, before God, who will condemn the murderer in the face of heaven. In the day of judgment, Lionel Withamstead, thou shalt meet me there." She ceased. The livid paleness and the damps of death had gradually gathered on her countenance. Every sentence had been uttered in mortal anguish. Nevertheless, she had maintained throughout the cold, calm bearing of one already separated from the body. The wretch to whom her words had been addressed shivered under their influence, as though exposed to an icy blast. Superstitious horror mastered the ferocious spirit, till then scarcely satisfied with its revenge. And setting spurs to his horse, he departed from the spot like one pursued by an evil spirit. "Let those who shot the arrows complete their work," said the dying maiden to the men, who remained fixed to the spot, subdued by some supernatural agency, and scarcely conscious of their leader's departure. "Let them wrap us in one shroud, and bury us in the same grave." One of the archers stepped forward. He was rude, even savage in his exterior, but nature was not utterly extinct. He kneeled down beside the dying and the dead, and swore to observe the request. "Thy victim blesses thee," replied Blanche. "Farewell." She spoke no more, for death claimed her conquest. She stretched herself on the ground beside him, whom in life she had loved so well, whom dying she could not forget. Placing one arm beneath his head, and the other across his bosom, so that her cheek rested against his, she meekly closed her eyes like a withered child that slept on its mother's lap. Thus died Lacy and Blanche de Vere, twins in birth, and twins also in the manner of their death. They slept not as their fathers before them, in marble monuments adorned with stately devices. They were laid in the peasant's grave, beneath the green and trodden turf, with no record more lasting than its bright but perishable flowers. There was none to mourn over them, none to have them in remembrance, none to perpetuate their name. When they died together, and with them the memory of a noble race, passed forever from the earth. So fails, so languishes, grows dim, and dies, all that this world is proud of. End of Section 8. Recording by Aidan Fitzgerald.
Section 9 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 5, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 9. To Elizabeth. We have often in our daily wanderings met with a face, fairer and more beautiful than any we have ever yet beheld, which has left upon our minds an impression that required weeks, in some cases months, to erase. It may be compared to a single ray of sunshine suddenly bursting its way, after an April shower, through a dense veil of clouds, gladdening the sight, and imparting an unaccountable feeling of happiness to the heart, but vanishing almost as quickly as it appears. Yet, although the ray is gone, the sensations aroused by its appearance remain behind. 'Tis strange that in this world of ours such sweet and gentle beings dwell, as cast o'er life's bright sunny hours a glow no pleasure can dispel. That face of thine, that sparkling eye, have nearly turned my ardent brain, and yet 'twould be a bliss to die, could I but see thee smile again. That pouting lip so full of scorn betrays thine anger with a friend, who deems thee all an angel born, and weeps to think he did offend. As poets sing, we mortals feel, a kindred spirit meets its like, our burning thoughts we thus reveal, and hearts with glowing hearts unite. Methinks when nature formed thine eye, radiant with gentleness and grace, she plucked a sunbeam from the sky, and traced each beauty for thy face. Since not in life 'twill be my lot to hear thy voice, nor see thee smile, I may not think I'm all forgot, yet still I'll think of thee the while. Whate'er may be thy lot on earth, may heaven grant thee ne'er to know the pang that rends this heart of mine, while life is left on earth below. But when thy soul is freed from earth, and wanders to its home above, may my lot be to sing its worth around the eternal throne of love. End of Section 9. Section 10 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 5, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 10. The Widow's Mite, by Robert Montgomery. Amid the pompous crowd of rich adorers came a humble form, a widow, meek as poverty could make her children, with a look of sad content, her mite within the treasure heap she cast. Then timidly, as bashful twilight, stole from out the temple, but her lowly gift was witnessed by an eye whose mercy views in motive all that consecrates a deed to goodness. So he blessed the widow's mite, beyond the gifts abounding wealth bestowed. Thus is it, Lord, with thee the heart is thine, and all the world of hidden action there works in thy sight, like waves beneath the sun, conspicuous, and 1,000 nameless acts that lurk in lowly secrecy and die unnoticed, like the trodden flowers that fall beneath a proud man's foot, to thee are known and written with a sunbeam in the book of life, where mercy fills the brightest page. End of Section 10. End of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 5, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree.